Ned Stark could not sleep. The candles in his solar had long since burned to stubs, the last flickering flames melting into shallow pools of wax. Outside, the wind whipped against the high walls of the Red Keep, rattling shutters and whistling through every crack. From the window, he could see the moonlit outline of Blackwater Bay. Somewhere across that dark water, more ships arrived each day to King's Landing, bringing commerce, courtiers, and whispers. The realm thrived on rumors like an unwelcome fungus, clinging to every unguarded moment. Ned understood too well that secrets could be as potent as swords. And tonight, he wrestled with a secret that might reshape the Seven Kingdoms. He had read and reread the book Grand Maester Pycelle had lent him, the lineages and histories of the great houses of the Seven Kingdoms, expecting at first to confirm only the most routine genealogical detail. Instead, it had offered a key to a puzzle whose final shape he had not entirely understood until now. The discrepancies in the hair colors of Baratheon heirs across centuries, the unbroken line of black-haired children from a Baratheon father, and yet Joffrey's brilliant blonde locks, identical to those of his brother and sister. Above all, the confirmation that each Baratheon child down the ages, save for one named by rumor as a rumored bastard or two, had possessed those dark features. Yet the king's supposed children were bright as beaten gold, perfect Lannister copies in miniature. It was not just Joffrey who shone golden, but Myrcella and Tommen as well. A trifecta of Lannister gold. The truth, written in blood rather than ink, was that these were Jaime's children, not Robert's. If Ned's suspicions were right, and he believed them to be so beyond a doubt, then it was no mere family squabble. It was treason, a great lie that had placed false heirs in line for the Iron Throne. He remembered that day in the Godswood when Cersei had approached him, caution laced in her words, trying to glean what he knew. She had spoken of her children's lineage in carefully measured remarks, deflecting but inadvertently confirming. In another life, he might have chosen discretion. He might have allowed her to flee with her children or find some quiet solution. But the memory of the battered form of Robert Baratheon, roaring with laughter at a feast one night, and the next day lying half-dead from a boar's tusk on a bed drenched with sweat, burned away Ned's illusions. The king had entrusted him to serve as hand, to guard the realm. Honor demanded that Ned do what was right, and so he had to act. But the question was how. In the quiet hours of the night, he turned that question over until his head ached. If he confronted Cersei privately, she would have time to escape, or time to sink her claws deeper into the city's defenses. If he told Robert alone, how would the king react in his drunken, frequently rash way? And if he remained silent, even out of a misguided sense of mercy, Joffrey would ascend, and the lie would solidify, scarring the kingdom for generations. It was dawn by the time he decided. He would go public. He would call upon the Great Hall and the Council, with the king present if at all possible, and he would present his evidence openly. A direct blow like ice cleaving the head from the body. No half measures or clandestine warnings. His father had once taught him that a swift cut ended suffering more certainly than 1,000 small wounds. And so, though it went against his every instinct of caution, Ned readied himself for the day ahead, resolved that he would not hide the truth. He summoned his daughters just after the dawn. Sansa and Arya arrived in his solar, each wearing sleepy confusion in her eyes. He had told them both to pack their things, that they might need to leave King's Landing soon. He offered no deeper explanation but impressed upon them the importance of strict obedience to whatever instructions he gave. Sansa looked stricken, frightened by the sternness in her father's eyes. Arya asked questions, brimming with curiosity, but he gave them no direct answers. He only reminded them to stay close to their septa or to Jory Castle, for trouble might come. Both girls, anxious but trusting in their father, bowed their heads and did as told. Ned then called on Lord Peter Baelish, who arrived with a sardonic smile. Littlefinger's first remark was some jest about how the hour was too early for pleasant intrigues, but Ned's steely expression silenced him. Ned told him plainly, "I have learned that Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen are not of King Robert's blood but of Cersei's brother's line. I mean to reveal this at court this very day." Peter's mocking smile wavered, replaced by a sly tilt of his head as he studied Ned's face. Whatever calculations he might have made in that moment, he gave away nothing in words. "And you trust the Lannisters will let this pass peacefully?" Peter said softly. "Truth is a blade that cuts the hand that wields it, Lord Stark. Better to have a clean cut than let the rot fester," Ned answered. Littlefinger's eyes flickered in thought. "Shall I gather the gold cloaks for your protection? The city watch is commanded by my dear friend Janos Slint. Well, a friend for a price, anyway." Ned regarded him warily. Peter had always been quick to offer half-bargains. The memory of that conversation in the brothel still stung. Littlefinger's readiness to discuss seizing the children while they were in the Red Keep. Ned nodded a curt agreement that some preparation should be made, but did not allow Peter's suggestions to linger too long in his mind. The man was as slippery as an eel, and Ned had no interest in bartering for advantage. "I only ask that law remain on our side, the king's side. If Robert supports me, the gold cloaks will have to abide." "If," Peter repeated with a mocking half-bow. "Then, by your leave, I shall see how best to assist." Ned watched him depart, uncertain if the man would help or hinder him, but he had no time to dwell on Peter Baelish's loyalties. Next, he summoned Grand Maester Pycelle, Ser Barristan Selmy, and Lord Renly Baratheon, who had quietly come to visit Ned after hearing rumors that Ned was investigating something about the royal children. Renly looked half ready to speak at once, eyes darting about for signs of watchers behind doors. But Ned stared them all down, made them swear confidence, and told them in plain speech what he had discovered. To Pycelle he said, "Your book laid out the truth in black and white. You may recall how each Baratheon child across recorded history carried black hair except these three. I intend to bring it before the king and the court. It is a matter of the succession, and it cannot be denied." Pycelle began to tremble. Whether in genuine surprise or in cunning pretense was hard to say. His watery eyes widened. "My lord, you cannot imagine that the queen would." But Ned cut him off. "I imagine nothing. I have proven it. And it is no longer a matter for private counsel." Ser Barristan's expression was heavy. He was not a man of political cunning. He was an old knight with a sense of duty as unyielding as steel. The sorrow in his gaze said enough. He believed Ned Stark, but dreaded the storm that would follow. Renly looked both shaken and thoughtful. The younger Baratheon brother obviously recalled how his own brother Robert fathered bastards with half the whores in the city, fathered so many even in the Stormlands, but never had he truly fathered a child with Cersei. The truth would undermine the entire monarchy. They stood in silence for a long minute until Ned said, "Be there at noon in the throne room. I will have the book. I will have my proof. Let the court come see for themselves the final truth of Joffrey's claim." They departed, some reluctant, others disturbed, but none able to dissuade him. Ned tried to brace himself for the day. His heart pounded. He was not a man who longed for bold theatrics. That was Robert's realm, or the realm of knights who fancied themselves heroes in song. Yet if he had to stand in that vast throne room, with its pillars and narrow high windows, in front of the entire realm's worth of watchers, he would do so with the calm and resolve of House Stark. Honor demanded it. While the sun climbed in the sky, Ned readied his evidence. The genealogical tome, the knowledge gleaned from the Baratheon lineage, and any hints gleaned from watchers in the Red Keep about Jaime's closeness to the queen. He had no illusions that some might call it slander or rumor. But let the color of the children's hair speak for itself. Let the king himself see this inescapable truth. Let the courtiers watch. He composed his words carefully in his head, while behind him, Jory Castle strapped him into his doublet and cloak and gently set Ice's scabbard across his back. In his mind, Ned pictured Cersei's face as she realized what was coming. He pictured Robert's expression, the unstoppable fury that would likely follow. He prayed to the old gods that the king would see reason. He prayed, too, for his daughters to stay safe. He dreaded that Sansa's illusions about Prince Joffrey would be shattered in the harshest possible way. But better that than to watch her wed a false prince. At last, the hour arrived. The throne room had begun to fill with the many lords and ladies, knights and functionaries, curious or compelled to attend. Word had spread that the hand intended to address matters of succession. Petyr Baelish had done his part by letting the rumor swirl just enough to draw a crowd. Noble houses from across Westeros, or at least those present in the capital, found their places. Lords from the Vale, the Westerlands, the Reach, the Stormlands, and the Crownlands. Even some from Dorne who were in the city on business. Their retinues fanned out around them, forming colorful clusters of heraldry. The gold cloaks lined the walls, and Ned could not fail to note that Janos Slynt was there, tight-lipped and watchful. At the far end, beneath the massive iron throne with its blades twisted and sharp edges jutting in all directions, King Robert Baratheon slumped. His face was weary, eyes bloodshot, as if he had drunk too heavily the night before. By his side stood Cersei Lannister, beautiful in a gown of emerald green and gold trim, her hair in shining waves down her back. Joffrey was there too, dressed in princely finery, glaring at the crowd with a mixture of arrogance and curiosity. Myrcella and Tommen were not present. Cersei had insisted they remain in their chambers. Around them, the Kingsguard stood in polished white armor. Jaime Lannister had not yet appeared, though Ned knew the man was rarely far from his twin. Next to the king, Ser Barristan stood as still as a statue, shifting only when King Robert looked to him questioningly. A hush fell when Lord Eddard Stark, Hand of the King, entered with measured steps. The Master of Laws, Lord Renly, was off to one side, and on the other side, the Master of Coin, Petyr Baelish, whose expression Ned could not read. Varys hovered somewhere behind the pillars, lips pursed in an inscrutable smile. Grand Maester Pycelle smoothed his robes with trembling fingers as Ned approached the dais. Ned bowed. He waited for the king's half-distracted recognition before speaking. Robert waved a thick hand irritably as if to say, "Get on with it." So Ned rose and addressed the hall, projecting his voice across the expanse. "My lords and ladies," he began, "we stand here under King Robert Baratheon, the rightful and anointed king of the Seven Kingdoms. Today, I speak not just as his hand, but as a man who has stumbled upon a terrible secret. It weighs upon me, and it threatens the integrity of this realm if left unspoken. I pray you will hear these words with both wisdom and caution." Some in the crowd exchanged nervous glances. Cersei fixed Ned with a cold stare, her eyes narrowing. Joffrey looked more annoyed than anything, fiddling restlessly. Robert, leaning forward, rasped, "Be quick, Ned. I haven't got all day for riddles." Ned inclined his head. "A secret concerns the blood that flows in the veins of the king's own named children. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen." He sensed the collective intake of breath. Dozens, if not hundreds, of watchers fell silent. Robert blinked in confusion. Cersei took a sharp breath but kept her composure. Ned continued, each word measured carefully, each phrase unwavering in clarity. "For thousands of years, the line of House Baratheon has passed from father to son, and each Baratheon child has displayed the black hair of their forebears. It is a trait so constant that to find otherwise is near unheard of. Yet here, in King's Landing, we see our prince and princess with hair of Lannister gold." A ripple in the crowd, uneasy shifting of feet. Some murmured that the children simply took after their mother. But Ned pressed on, opening the large tome in his hands, letting the firelight catch on its ancient pages. "This is the lineages and histories of the great houses of the Seven Kingdoms, compiled by the hands of many maesters. Within it, you will find that every trueborn Baratheon, from Orys Baratheon forward, bore hair dark as night, black as coal, save these three living in the Red Keep." He let the hush deepen. Robert's brow wrinkled. He glanced at Cersei, who wore a mask of disdain. "Is that all?" the king said, sounding disgruntled. "You're telling me they're Lannister blonde because their mother is a Lannister? That's hardly a secret, Ned." But Ned kept his gaze steady on Robert's face. "Not all, your grace," and his next words had to be as direct as a sword thrust. "I have reason to believe that these children are not of your grace's seed, but rather born of the queen's incestuous union with her own brother, Ser Jaime Lannister." A thunderclap of horror washed over the throne room. The watchers gasped, reeled back, exclaiming in shock. A chorus of outraged voices burst forth. The gold cloaks stiffened, some exchanging confused glances. Varys, behind a pillar, raised both eyebrows high. Peter Baelish's mouth curled into a faint, almost triumphant twist. He loved chaos. Robert Baratheon lurched upright on the Iron Throne, face purpling with rage. "What did you say?" he roared, voice echoing among the columns. He half rose, grip tightening on the arm of the throne so hard his knuckles turned white. Ned forced himself not to quail before that fury. "I have read the histories. I have seen enough to know that Joffrey cannot be your son. He is no Baratheon. He is a Lannister." Joffrey, scarlet-faced, spat. "That's a filthy lie. Mother, make him take it back." Cersei's voice rang out, as cool and hard as chipped ice. "This is treason, my Lord Hand. To slander the royal children is a monstrous crime." Ser Barristan looked from Ned to Robert, his face torn. Renly's lips parted in an expression of shock, but he did not speak immediately. Pycelle hemmed and hawed, too afraid to interrupt. The hall broke into an eruption of stunned voices. Lords craned forward, ladies drew back with horrified expressions, and across the wide floor, the tension could have been cut with a knife. Ned raised the tome again. "Your Grace, please look here. The Baratheon's line is distinct. I observed the bastard children your Grace has fathered, all with black hair. Every last one. But your 3 named heirs? Golden-haired. All. Explain it if you can." The king was breathing heavily, fists clenched. His gaze flicked to Cersei, who did not shrink. Instead, she turned to Robert, her lips forming a tight line. "My children are yours," she said with well-feigned indignation. "Lord Stark has lost his reason. He is resentful of House Lannister. He seeks our downfall to avenge old grudges." Robert's eyes lit with a suspicion that turned, flickered, turned again. He looked from Cersei to Joffrey, from Joffrey's bright hair to Ned's grave face. The king was remembering the times he tried to bed Cersei and was refused, the hush in the bedchambers, the times he saw Jaime leave or saw them together. The seed of doubt began to sprout. If there was one trait the king possessed in spades besides his lust for battle and wine, it was jealousy. He had once raged at the mere mention of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. Now that same jealousy began to coil in his gut. Could it be that his wife had cuckolded him with her own brother? Cersei, feeling Robert's suspicion, placed a gentle hand on his arm, seeking to placate him. Her voice was calm but resonant enough to carry. "Husband, you know me. You know I would never. This man is a traitor, twisting trifles." Robert gripped her wrist. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Then, almost too softly for the watchers far away, the king demanded, "Is it true?" Her mask did not crack. "How can you believe?" he roared. "Is it true?" For a moment, a hush so absolute fell that one could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Then Cersei set her jaw. There was still a chance to deny it, to spin some new falsehood. Yet her pride would not let her cower. She jerked her hand free of Robert's bruising grip. "I see how it is," she said, each word controlled. "You never loved me, you never wanted me. Our marriage was a farce. You spent more time whoring, hunting, or singing praises to your precious Lyanna. And now you'll listen to Eddard Stark's ravings rather than hear your own wife." But she did not outright deny the accusation. She could have spat no, but she chose to accuse him instead. It was not lost on Robert, nor on the entire hall. Ned's voice carried again. "Your Grace, the truth stands before you. I beg that you see reason. As your hand, as your friend, I cannot let this lie continue. For the sake of the realm, we must name the rightful heir. You have a true brother, Stannis. By all the laws of inheritance, the crown should pass to Stannis if, 7 forgive me, something should befall your Grace. Joffrey cannot inherit." He paused, glancing at the crowd. "These are not your true-born children. Joffrey shrieked with indignation. "Guards! Cut his head off! He dares call me a bastard!" The boy's pale cheeks had turned red. Cersei hissed at her son, trying to calm him, but Robert stared at Joffrey as if seeing him for the first time, seeing the shape of his nose, the brightness of that Lannister gold hair, the disdain in his eyes. Something in the king broke. He seized one of the arms of the Iron Throne, ignoring the sharp metal points digging into his palm, and pulled himself upright. "Guards, guard!" He coughed, spluttered, tried again. "Seize! No, hold your places." He was half in shock, half in volcanic anger, hardly knowing what to do. He glared at Ned. "What do you want me to do?" Ned bowed his head. "Your Grace, the law is clear. You must name Joffrey for what he is. Disown him. The line of succession passes to your true brother, Lord Stannis Baratheon, and the Queen and her brother." He drew a breath. They must face the king's justice. Now the hall dissolved into an uproar. The words "King's Justice" rung out like the toll of a funeral bell for the Lannisters. Lannister guards among the crowd surged forward, swords half drawn, uncertain if they should defend the queen. The gold cloaks tensed, awaiting orders from either the king or their immediate superiors. Robert was pinned between shock and rage, looking as though he might strike Cersei dead with his bare hands. Cersei stood proud, but the fear beneath her pride was visible to those who knew where to look. She had not prepared for a direct, public confrontation like this. She had gambled on Ned Stark's sense of caution, or on the secrecy that Alwa YS pervaded the Red Keep. Instead, Ned had forced her into open day. Varys stepped out from behind a pillar, voice as smooth as silk. "Your Grace, if I might." Robert whirled on him. "Silence." He turned to Ned. "By all the gods, Ned, are you certain?" Ned met his eyes, unwavering. "I wish I were not." Robert bellowed. "Cersei, is it true? Is it Jaime's seed in your belly? Are these children truly?" His teeth ground so hard that spittle flew from his lips. He advanced a step. Cersei, with all the regal defiance she could muster, did not retreat, but nor did she answer. The silence from her was answer enough. Her chin lifted, her glare unwavering, and for the first time in memory, tears rimmed her emerald eyes, though they did not fall. "You vile—" Robert seized her arm, and the watchers recoiled as if they themselves felt the force of his grip. Suddenly, Joffrey lurched forward. "Release my mother," he shouted. The boy had a dagger at his hip. He tried to draw it, though his hand shook. Quick as a flash, Ser Barristan stepped between Joffrey and the king, while two gold cloaks, uncertain, hovered in place, their swords half out of their scabbards. The throne room hovered on the brink of violence. "Don't be a fool, boy," Ser Barristan said quietly. "Put that away before you do something you cannot take back." Joffrey glowered, tears of rage in his eyes. "He is not my father. My father is the greatest knight in the realm." The slip of the tongue was almost comedic if the moment had not been so deadly. Barristan's gaze darkened with pity. King Robert roared wordlessly, releasing Cersei with a shove that nearly toppled her. Then he wavered, as though the ground itself threatened to give way beneath him. The Iron Throne loomed behind him, monstrous in its twisted metal. The entire court waited. Ned approached, voice lowered for Robert's ears. "Your Grace, we must place the Queen under guard. We must gather the council. The realm needs your leadership." Robert's heart pounded like a drum in his chest. He was never a man for careful steps or balanced deliberation. "Jaime," he growled. "Where is Jaime?" He scanned the hall for the Kingslayer, but Jaime was not present. A prudent man might guess that he was near enough, standing by with Lannister men. The king turned on Janos Slynt, who stood among the gold cloaks. "You," he barked, "find the Kingslayer. Bring him to me in chains if you must." Slynt swallowed, uncertain. It was no small thing to stand against the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, especially with Lannister gold behind him. But Robert's rage was not to be gainsaid. "At once, Your Grace," he croaked, and gestured to some men to follow him. Cersei's eyes darted to the exit, as though measuring her chances of flight. She must have known that her position was precarious in the extreme. The entire throne room had witnessed the king's furious outburst, had heard Ned Stark's accusations. And more than that, they had seen how she had not denied it. The hush grew thick with tension. Robert turned again, pointing a shaking finger at Joffrey. "Get this boy out of my sight, to the black cells if necessary." Another wave of shock and horror flitted across the watchers' faces. Cersei opened her mouth to protest, but Robert roared, "Don't you dare speak! Don't you dare! I'll not kill the boy." He dragged a heavy breath into his lungs. "But he'll not roam free, passing himself off as a prince in my own hall." That was the moment when the tension snapped. Several of the Lannister guards, men loyal to Tywin, not the gold cloaks loyal to the city, moved forward protectively. One stepped near Joffrey, hand on his sword hilt. Ser Barristan and 2 gold cloaks stepped forward to block them, eyes grim. The watchers began backing away, some pressing to the sides of the throne room to avoid the potential melee. Ned Stark, alarmed, raised his voice. "Lay down your arms! Obey the king!" Cersei's expression of fury and anguish twisted her face. She saw that the tide was turning irreversibly against her and her son. A cunning survival instinct flashed in her eyes. She opened her mouth, perhaps to call to the Lannister guards to defend Joffrey, or perhaps to attempt some last subterfuge, when a commotion erupted at the huge doors to the hall. Jaime Lannister stepped in, flanked by a dozen heavily armed men in crimson cloaks. They were Lannister men, loyal to Tywin or directly to the Queen's brother. The crowd parted as they advanced, steel glinting under the high windows. Jaime's gaze swept the room. He saw the contorted expression on Robert's face, saw Ned Stark standing near the dais with the genealogical tome under his arm, saw the drawn weapons of gold cloaks and Lannister men. He took in the sight of his sister, shaken but proud, standing near Joffrey, who looked ready to cry with anger. Jaime's lip curled in something akin to a mad grin. "Well," he said, "this is quite the gathering. What have I missed?" Robert's voice came like thunder, as though all the fury in his being had coalesced into a single brand of hatred. "Kingslayer," he spat, "you have bedded my wife. You have given her your bastards. You dare enter my presence armed." Jaime's eyes shifted momentarily to Cersei, whose lips parted in silent warning. Then, with casual insolence, he placed a hand on the pommel of his sword. "Such harsh accusations, your grace. Incest, bastardy. Quite the talk." His gaze flicked to Joffrey. "I see young Joff is upset. Perhaps we should discuss this more privately." The last word was spoken with a mocking tilt of his head. Robert stepped down from the throne with surprising speed for so large a man. "There is no privacy for traitors," he declared. "No privacy for usurpers of my throne. By the gods, Jaime Lannister, I should have put your head on a pike the day you slew the Mad King." Jaime took a slow breath. "You might have if you'd been there. Pity you weren't." The gold cloaks looked to Ned Stark for direction, or to the king for a clear order. Ned realized the entire throne room was a tinderbox. A single wrong command could ignite a bloodbath. Still, Ned's duty was clear. These men had come brandishing steel in the king's presence, and Jaime was the prime suspect in an incestuous scandal that threatened the monarchy. Ned stepped forward, raising a hand. "Ser Jaime, surrender your sword in the name of the king." A hush. Jaime's grin wavered. His men cast uncertain glances at him. Then Jaime said, "The king? Which king, Stark? The one enthroned, or the one who mules about books of lineage?" His tone dripped with scorn. "We all know how this ends. The Lannisters will not yield. We do not yield." He flicked his gaze to Robert. "You've lived on borrowed time, you drunken fool. My father will not stand idly by while you degrade House Lannister. You think you can hold the capital with your pitiful gold cloaks? You Stark, upstart from the north. Do you believe your honor will keep you safe?" Ned's face hardened. "Yield, Ser Jaime, or your blood will stain these tiles." Jaime laughed. a wild and dangerous laugh, steel rasping against leather as he drew his blade. "Then let's end this here and now." His men raised their weapons. The gold cloaks moved, half with swords drawn, half with pikes lowered, and behind them strode Ser Barristan. Robert, in a frothing rage, barked, "Kill the traitors! Kill them all except the queen. She must face trial. And that bastard boy too. No one kills them without my leave." Chaos erupted. Several of the Lannister guards tried to push forward to shield Cersei and Joffrey, but the gold cloaks, more numerous, quickly formed a ring. Steel clashed against steel. People screamed and scrambled away from the fight. Jaime Lannister, a fierce grin on his face, met Ser Barristan's blade in a ringing exchange of blows. Both men were legendary warriors, both members of the Kingsguard, former and current. Barristan, older but as swift as a serpent, pressed Jaime with a flurry of strikes. Jaime's men shouted, "Lannister!" and tried to join the duel, but gold cloaks flanked them, forcing them back in a swirling melee. Ned stood close to the dais, shielding the king with his body if need be. He took no pleasure in the violence, but no man questioned that if Jaime pressed the attack, Ned Stark would raise ice in Robert's defense. Indeed, Ned drew his greatsword now, the ancestral blade of House Stark. The crowd parted, terrified, pressed against the pillars and walls. Over the clamoring din, the ring of swords, and the shrieks of onlookers, Ned heard Cersei's voice calling for Joffrey to follow her. The two retreated behind Lannister men, seeking an exit, but gold cloaks converged from each side. Robert bellowed, "Do not let them leave! By the gods! I'll see them locked away this day." That gave Jaime fresh desperation. He broke from Barristan's onslaught and lunged for Ned, who stepped between Jaime and the dais. The clang of steel resounded as Jaime hammered at ice. Though Ned was no feeble man, Jaime Lannister's skill was truly fearsome. Sparks flew as ice met Jaime's sword. Ned gritted his teeth, pushing the Kingslayer back. Barristan joined the fray from the side, swinging with lethal precision. Jaime cursed and spun, forced to defend on two fronts. Even Jaime Lannister could not match two formidable knights at once for long. Barristan feinted high, then lunged, scoring a shallow cut across Jaime's sword arm. The Kingslayer hissed in pain. He tried to break away, realized the ring of gold cloaks had closed in, and found himself with no route to Cersei or Joffrey. Furious, eyes blazing, he whirled on Ser Barristan, but Ned lunged, forcing Jaime to pivot. Jaime's men were in disarray, outnumbered by the city watch and with no chance to escape. Cersei and Joffrey found themselves hemmed in near the left side of the hall, their path blocked by pikes. "You fools!" Cersei screamed at the gold cloaks. "I am your queen!" But the watchmen obeyed the king's roars, not hers. One man stepped forward, clapped heavy irons around Joffrey's wrists. The boy fought like a cornered animal, kicking and spitting until another watchman pinned him in a half-grapple. The watchers stared, hardly able to believe their eyes as the prince was manhandled by common guards. When Jaime realized Joffrey had been taken, a feral light entered his eyes. He lunged with raw fury, bellowing, "Unhand him!" But Barristan and Ned, working in tandem, forced Jaime's blade aside, pinned him against a pillar, and Ned kicked the back of Jaime's knee, sending him stumbling. Barristan's sword, swift and sure, slammed into Jaime's own blade, knocking it from his hand. A second later, the tip of the Lord Commander's sword hovered at Jaime's throat. The Kingslayer was breathing heavily, sweat trickling down his face. His hair was disheveled, and blood ran freely from the cut on his arm. The Lannister men, seeing him disarmed, began to yield. Gold cloaks rushed forward to seize them, to prise swords from their hands and drag them back. In the hush that followed, Robert Baratheon's voice rose, cracked with intensity. "Bind him, bind them all. I'll have justice, and I will have it now." His eyes fell on Cersei, who was flanked by 4 gold cloaks. "So it is true," he said with a grim finality. "You whore, my own wife. I should have known." He spat on the floor at her feet. She stared back defiantly, face pale, eyes brimming with unspent tears. Jaime said nothing, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Joffrey, still pinned, howled, "You can't do this. I'm the prince. I—" A watchman slapped a hand over the boy's mouth to muffle him. Ned exchanged a quick glance with Ser Barristan, whose noble face reflected heartbreak at the dissolution of everything the Kingsguard was meant to stand for. Then Ned stepped up to Robert, trying to steady the king's wrath before it devolved into immediate bloodshed. "Your Grace, it is done. The traitors are in hand. We must handle this carefully. These are matters that concern the entire realm." Robert blinked as though trying to clear a haze. "Ah, yes, yes." He glowered at the bound forms of Cersei, Jaime, Joffrey, and the handful of Lannister guards who had survived. "They will be judged. The realm will know their crimes." Then his voice turned cold. "I want them in the black cells. I want Tywin Lannister to know that if he dares raise a hand, I'll see his children's heads on spikes." He spat again. "All of them, Your Grace?" one watchman asked hesitantly, glancing at Myrcella and Tommen's absence. Robert set his jaw. "Fetch the other two from their chambers. They're as false as the boy. They'll join their mother. None of this brood is mine." The watchers whispered. Some looked ill. Even Ned felt a pang of pity for the children, Myrcella and Tommen, who were innocents in so many ways. But he pressed his lips together, giving the order. "They must be placed under guard as well, but treated gently. They are but children." Robert let out a derisive snort. "Children of incest." The gold cloaks nodded and rushed off. At last, the throne room began to clear, the watchers dispersing in uneasy hush, as if they feared the slightest whisper might bring more violence. Ned felt the tremors in his own hands. He fought to keep them still. Blood was spattered across the polished floor. Lannister men lay groaning or still. The small folk and courtiers slipped away, many glancing over their shoulders in shock. The king himself sank back onto the iron throne, letting out a ragged breath, eyeing the bound captives with unbridled hatred. Ned approached once more, voice hushed. "Your Grace, the realm will be shaken by this. The lords of the 7 kingdoms must be informed." Robert's glare remained on the captives. "They'll be informed soon enough. Let them curse the Lannisters. I'll have Tywin's head if he moves against me." He turned that glare on Ned. "You say Stannis is the rightful heir after me?" "By all the laws of succession, yes, Your Grace. Stannis is your eldest younger brother. If there is no issue of your own blood, it must pass to him." Robert's face twisted in grudging acknowledgement. "So be it. We'll call Stannis here. He can stand witness at the trial. We'll see what is to be done. But first, we must see justice done for this betrayal." Cersei, still bound, looked at Robert with bottomless loathing. Jaime whispered something to her, too soft for Ned to hear. Robert then turned on them both, roaring to the gold cloaks. "Take them to the black cells. If they resist, kill them." It took another flurry of activity to escort the prisoners out. Jaime was marched away, his wound dripping blood onto the floor. Cersei was manacled. She spat at Robert, who merely looked at her with scorn. Joffrey's shrill protests faded as the watchman dragged him down the corridor, flanked by Lannister guards who had yielded and been stripped of their arms. The roars and murmurs of the crowd continued in the outer hallways. A civil war had been averted in that instant, but the realm teetered precariously. The story would spread like wildfire through King's Landing. The Queen and Joffrey unmasked as incestuous pretenders, Jaime Lannister arrested, the children taken into custody. Ned lowered his sword, letting the tip rest on the ground. His heart pounded with exhaustion and the weight of what had just occurred. King Robert slumped in the Iron Throne, and for a moment it seemed the massive structure might swallow him in its twisted metal. In a voice that only Ned and a few others close by could hear, Robert said, "I should have listened to you from the start. You tried to warn me about them, about her. 7 hells, Ned. What have we done?" Ned knew that Robert's rage would soon be replaced by an even more terrible fury or possibly by some drowning in drink. It was not over. If Tywin Lannister heard of this, he would not stand idle. The realm stood on a knife's edge. Yet the truth was out. The lie had been dragged into the light. Ned only prayed it would not plunge the Seven Kingdoms into unimaginable strife. Even so, part of him felt an odd relief. He had acted with the honor he cherished. No secrets, no subterfuge. The city had trembled, but the truth remained the truth. For now, that would have to suffice. In the days that followed, King's Landing quaked with political aftershocks. Whispers ran wild in every alley, brothel, and feast hall. The crowds hissed and spat when they spoke of the incestuous Lannisters. For the scandal had a lurid appeal that no gossip could resist. Word spread that the king had flung his queen and her children into the black cells, that Jaime Lannister was wounded and captive. No one quite knew what Tywin Lannister might do in response. Armies could march. The Gold Cloaks doubled their patrols, anticipating that Lannister riders might try to strike the city, but for the moment, quiet tension reigned. Inside the Red Keep, Ned Stark seldom left Robert's side. They spent long hours conferring in the king's solar. Renly joined them, eyes brimming with ideas. Peter Baelish appeared at times, face full of mild curiosity. Varys offered sly counsel, though Robert had begun to eye the eunuch with suspicion. The question on everyone's mind was how to handle the fallout. One urgent matter was the small council's stance. With the Queen locked away and the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard arrested, some seats were in sudden disarray. The Master of Whispers, Master of Coin, Lord Commander, all hovered in uncertain territory. Barristan Selmy remained as Lord Commander in truth if not recognized by the Lannisters, while Jaime was obviously unfit to hold the White Cloak. Pycelle still served as Grand Maester, but his loyalties were doubted by Ned, who recalled the man's dissembling. Another question was the children. Myrcella and Tommen had been brought from their chambers trembling. The watchmen had been gentle, but the children were still frightened out of their wits. They were confined with their mother in a more comfortable set of rooms guarded day and night, a partial mercy. Robert, in a grudging gesture, had agreed with Ned that the little ones had no direct blame for their parents' sins. But the king was adamant that they must never sit on the throne. In truth, they were hostages now, valuable pieces in the chessboard of the realm. Cersei, for her part, refused to speak to any of them. She demanded a trial by combat, or at least demanded to see her father. "When Lord Tywin comes, you'll all be sorry," she hissed at the guards. The black cells had been replaced by a suite near Maegor's Holdfast, with boarded windows and guards at the door. On Ned's advice, Robert had decided to allow some measure of decency for the mother of these children, if only to forestall Tywin's immediate wrath. Ned suspected that Tywin might well march from the west with all his host to ransom or reclaim his daughter and grandchildren. Meanwhile, Joffrey's fury burned hot in his lavish but locked chamber. The watchman reported that he refused to eat for a day, screaming, threatening to kill them all. Yet no sword was allowed near him. Ned visited once, wanting to see the boy for himself, but found only a sullen, resentful youth who glared daggers at the hand. "I'll kill you and your whoresons," Joffrey spat. "When the throne is mine, I'll feed you to the dogs." Ned quietly reminded him that he would never inherit the throne. If Joffrey was anything, he was an inglorious hostage. Robert found solace in drink, though he also found bursts of violent energy in which he'd stomp about, making grand proclamations or shouting for the guards to keep better watch. He demanded that ravens be sent to Stannis on Drago, in stone, summoning him to King's Landing to be recognized formally as next in line. He also sent a blunt message to Tywin Lannister, effectively accusing him of encouraging this incestuous betrayal and warning him that if any Lannister forces approached the city without his express permission, the hostages would pay the price. It was a savage threat, and one that made Ned uneasy, but Robert's fury knew few bounds. In this swirling chaos, Sansa Stark rarely left her rooms. She was mortified, terrified, and heartbreakingly disappointed to learn that Joffrey was not only cruel but false, that he was not truly the golden prince of her girlish dreams, but rather a product of incest who had threatened her father's life. Arya, on the other hand, was relieved. She said the boy was always a liar, Ned tried to comfort them both, but the gulf in Sansa's eyes was vast. Perhaps the illusions of childhood had been stripped from her too brutally. Time plodded on. A week became 2. Word finally arrived that Lord Tywin Lannister, upon hearing the news, was rallying his bannermen in the west. The rumor said he had assembled no fewer than 20,000 men near the Golden Tooth. Another rumor claimed that Tyrion Lannister, Cersei's dwarf brother, was hastening from the Vale with some new allies, possibly clansmen or sellswords. Indeed, the realm seemed on the verge of a conflict that might make Robert's rebellion look tame. For if Tywin decided to name Joffrey as rightful king despite the revelations, and pressed that claim by force of arms, half the realm might follow or fear the Lannisters enough to align with them. Yet the majority, hearing the scandalous truth, might refuse to back an incest-born pretender. Robert was determined not to yield an inch. He had the City Watch, which numbered in the thousands, though not nearly enough to face a Lannister army in open battle. He also commanded the loyalty of the Crownlands houses, many of which were sworn to him as the rightful king. But Robert's health and vigor were not what they had once been. His nights were spent in drink, and though he made a show of training in the yard, he was out of breath quickly. A man grown fat on wine and sweethearts, as many in the city said. Still, his love of battle was inextinguishable. "If Tywin wants war, we'll give him war," he roared one day, after finishing half a hogshead of mead. "I'll smash him like I smashed Rhaegar on the Trident." Ned watched with disquiet. War was the last thing he wanted. But if the Lannisters could not accept the downfall of Joffrey's claim, if Tywin marched, war seemed inevitable. Ned prayed to the old gods that it might be avoided. He tried to counsel caution, urging Robert to treat with Tywin, perhaps to find some compromise. But the king would not hear of a compromise. "He put his line in my bed, Ned," Robert snapped. "He dishonored me beyond measure. I'd sooner dine with the Greyjoys." As for Stannis, who had been summoned, no raven came in reply. The courtiers whispered that Stannis was building ships, or that he was gathering loyal men from the Stormlands. None knew for sure. Ned suspected that Stannis was not the type to hurry to King's Landing with a small escort. He would come prepared or not at all. Ser Barristan had quietly urged Ned to see if some kind of hearing could be arranged for Jaime Lannister, who languished in a dungeon cell. The proud knight-turned-Kingslayer was recovering from his wound, though not in comfort. Ned had no personal fondness for the man, but it pained him that the once honorable institution of the Kingsguard had been so tarnished. Barristan also believed that a formal trial might quell the realm's thirst for a solution. Let Jaime either confess or face trial by combat, as the law allowed. If he lost, the matter would be put to rest. If he somehow prevailed, well, the gods would have spoken, though it promised even more complications. One morning, Ned brought this suggestion to the king over a morning meal. Robert, bleary-eyed from the night's drink, growled that Jaime should be executed without trial. But Ned pressed him with the argument that it might provoke the Westerlands to immediate war. "Perhaps a trial by combat will allow the Lannisters to see we are not murdering Jaime in cold blood," Ned said. "If he loses, the god's judgment is final. No man can dispute it." Robert squinted at Ned with an intense frustration. "I want him dead, Ned. I want them all dead. I want to send Tywin his head in a box." "But you're right," he muttered with reluctance, perhaps understanding that an execution without trial would send the worst message. "Fine, a trial by combat it is. Who will champion the realm's case? Barristan? You?" Ned let out a slow breath. Barristan was older but still formidable. The question was, would the realm see it as fair if the king's own Lord Commander stood champion against Jaime Lannister? Some might not. Ser Barristan is a legend. Jaime may not stand a chance, he ventured. Robert let out a laugh, harsh. "By the gods, let them say it is unfair. After what that golden bastard did, I care little for his sense of fairness." But he waved a hand. "Let Barristan do it. Or you. I don't care. As long as we see his blood on the floor if the gods are just." Ned nodded. "And the queen? Will she be tried as well?" Robert's eyes turned grim. "Oh yes, but I might do it differently. Let her stand before the court. She can beg for mercy if she likes, or she can choose a champion of her own if she demands trial by combat. Then I'll name her champion to face the best knight in the city. That will be the end of her treachery." His lip curled. "We'll see how proud she is when no one stands to defend her. No one but Jaime, and he'll likely be dead." Ned tried to imagine how that spectacle would unfold. Cersei, proud as she was, might indeed demand a champion, but who would fight for her? Tywin might send a champion if he marched in time. Or perhaps the mountain Ser Gregor Clegane. The realm quaked at the thought. If it came to open war, thousands would die. "If we do this," Ned said softly, "we must do it soon. The longer we wait, the more time Lord Tywin has to gather his forces. We risk him storming King's Landing to free them all." The king nodded. "Then see that it's done, Lord Hand. Summon the court in the throne room. 3 days hence, Jaime will have his trial by combat, if that's what he demands. Afterward, we will see to the queen." Ned did not relish it, but he bowed, for he knew this was the only path Robert would countenance. Better a formal trial than a midnight execution. Those 3 days passed in a whirlwind. The city seethed with rumor. Some claimed that Tywin was riding at the head of a massive army only a fortnight's march away. Others whispered that half the houses in the Reach were preparing to declare independence, uncertain about the king's decisions. Even more muttered about Renly Baratheon, who had quickly left King's Landing with Loras Tyrell to visit Highgarden, prompting speculation that he might put forth his own claim to the throne. Ned was left with a sense that the realm was fracturing under the weight of Robert's fury and the Lannisters' pride. Finally, the appointed day came. The trial by combat was to be held in the throne room, a place large enough for a spectacle of that nature. Robert insisted on sitting the Iron Throne again, though Ned tried to encourage a more neutral setting. Crowds gathered in every passageway outside the hall, kept at bay by the gold cloaks. Inside, many of the noble lords and ladies of the court found vantage points near the pillars. Sansa and Arya, at Ned's command, remained in their chambers. He did not wish them to see a man possibly killed in such a brutal fashion. But many others attended, thirsting for the drama. Jaime Lannister was led in. His hands were unbound this time, for he was to fight if he demanded it. He wore light armor, borrowed from the Red Keep stores. His face was pale beneath a mask of arrogant pride, though Ned saw the grim determination in his eyes. The cut on his arm was healing but still fresh. The watchers spoke in low voices, some in awe, some in fear. This was the Kingslayer, facing a public reckoning for incest, for fathering bastards upon the queen, for betraying the crown. Ned and Ser Barristan stood near the dais. Robert watched with simmering intensity, a goblet of wine in his hand. Pycelle, Peter Baelish, and Varys hovered to one side, the small council incomplete but present. The herald stepped forward, recited the charges of treason and incest. Jaime made no attempt to deny them, though he sneered occasionally. He demanded a trial by combat as expected. "I will let the gods decide," he said, voice echoing in the chamber. "And if the gods are just, I will walk out of here a free man." His gaze flicked to Robert, full of challenge. Robert declared that Ser Barristan Selmy would champion the crown. Barristan, not entirely pleased at the show, stepped forward. The Lord Commander looked Jaime in the eye, sorrow in his face. "We were sworn brothers once. You have disgraced the Kingsguard, but I will not shirk my duty now." Jaime's lips curled in a mirthless smile. "Honor," he said quietly, "is a curious thing, Ser Barristan. I suppose we'll see whose steel is stronger." Ned stepped aside as the two knights squared off in the open space of the throne room. The watchers fell silent. Swords were drawn. Jaime had a long sword from the Red Keep's armory, while Barristan held his familiar blade. They circled each other, armor clinking softly on the marble floor. Then the fight began. It was swift, brutal, and skillful. Both men were among the finest swordsmen in Westeros. Barristan's footwork was impeccable, Jaime's reflexes razor-sharp. Steel clashed, sending echoes ringing through the chamber. The watchers gasped as blow followed blow, each man testing the other's defenses. Jaime's wounded arm slowed him slightly, but his cunning was formidable. He feinted high, then swung low, forcing Barristan to pivot and block. A flurry of strikes forced Barristan back, but the older knight parried each blow with a calm that belied his age. Jaime pressed the attack, seeing an opening in Barristan's left side. He lunged, but Barristan turned deftly, deflecting the strike and countering with a slash that Jaime barely twisted away from. Sparks flew. Robert leaned forward on the throne, his knuckles white on the goblet, a savage gleam in his eyes. Peter Baelish watched with languid interest, while Pycelle wrung his hands. With each clash, Jaime's strength seemed to wane, a combination of the healing wound and the exertion. Barristan seized the advantage, weaving a pattern of measured strikes. At last, with a swift pivot, he knocked Jaime's blade aside and smashed the pommel into Jaime's temple. Jaime staggered, nearly dropping his sword. Barristan pivoted again, his weapon at Jaime's throat in a fraction of a heartbeat. The watchers gasped. Blood trickled down Jaime's cheek from a cut above his temple. He panted, struggling to gather himself, sword wavering in his hand. Barristan's face was set, gaze resolute. "Yield," he said, voice carrying softly across the hush. For a moment, Jaime's expression flickered between fury and despair. Then he let out a harsh breath, dropping his sword with a clang upon the marble. "I yield," he spat, voice cracking. A thunderous silence fell, broken only by the shuffle of gold cloaks stepping forward to secure Jaime's arms once more. Robert stood from the iron throne, raising his goblet. "The gods have spoken," he roared. "Ser Jaime Lannister is guilty of the crimes laid against him. He yields his life to my mercy, or my justice." He paused, letting that hang in the air. Jaime did not look away, though fear flickered in his eyes. Ned watched Robert carefully. The king was unpredictable, a man who might condemn or spare on a whim. He had named the trial by combat as the god's judgment. Jaime had lost. By the older traditions, that meant his guilt was proven, and the king had every right to sentence him to death. But Robert's mind had its own logic. He might prefer a public beheading or might decide that Tywin's vengeance demanded a strategic approach. "His life is forfeit," Robert declared at last, glaring at Jaime. "But I will not kill him here in this hall. No, let him spend the rest of his days in a black cell, or until Tywin Lannister yields to my demands. Then I'll decide if he's worth ransoming or if we'll mount his head on a spike." The watchers breathed in relief or shock, depending on their views. Some had expected a swift beheading. Others had feared Robert would relent too easily. Ned suspected that Robert was not done punishing Jaime. Keeping the Kingslayer prisoner served as a bargaining chip against Tywin, a threat that might quell an outright assault on King's Landing. Or so Robert hoped. "Take him away," Robert commanded. "And if he tries to escape, kill him." Jaime's face was hollow as the gold cloaks pulled him up. He looked for a fleeting instant like he might protest, or beg for the mercy of a quick death, but he set his jaw and said nothing. They led him from the throne room, a hush trailing in his wake. Robert, panting slightly from the adrenaline coursing through him, sat back on the throne. "Now," he growled, "for the Queen." He looked at Ned. "We will convene another such proceeding. Let her speak or remain silent as she likes. If she demands a champion, who will stand for her now?" It was a question that hung in the air. Ser Gregor was not present in the city. The Hound was nowhere to be seen. Upon hearing the accusations, Sandor Clegane had quietly left the capital, some said. Tywin was not here to propose a champion. Jaime was now defeated and imprisoned. Who would champion Cersei's cause? Perhaps no one. Perhaps she would yield. Ned bowed. "Your Grace, we must give her time to respond. By the laws of the land, she's entitled to a fair hearing, to the same right of trial by combat. Let us summon her in 3 days' time." Robert gave a curt nod, though impatience and anger still simmered in his eyes. "So be it. But if she fails to produce a champion, or if she refuses to appear, I'll condemn her in absentia. The children remain my hostages until Tywin Lannister kneels. That is all." Thus concluded the trial of Jaime Lannister, an event that would reverberate across Westeros. The Watchers departed, muttering among themselves. Ned felt a heavy weight in his chest, a sense that the realm was splintering under the force of these revelations and retributions. Barristan Selmy removed his helm, face drawn with sorrowful satisfaction. "I have done my duty," he said quietly. "But the Kingsguard is no more, it seems. We are broken." Ned put a hand on the old knight's shoulder. "You have upheld your vows, Ser Barristan. The fault lies with those who broke them, not you." Barristan nodded gratefully, though the sadness did not leave his eyes. Cersei's hearing arrived 3 days later. The tension in the city had risen to a fever pitch by that time. Rumors swirled that Tywin's host was marching east. Ravens from the Riverlands reported sightings of large contingents of Lannister soldiers. House Stark had begun sending messages north, urging Robb to prepare the Bannermen to respond to any threat. Meanwhile, local lords in the Crownlands hurried to King's Landing, or left in haste, uncertain which side to take if war erupted. Cersei was brought forth from her guarded suite. Robert had demanded that she wear shackles, but Ned convinced him to allow her a measure of dignity. So she was not chained, though gold cloaks surrounded her on every side. She looked pale but determined, clad in a simple gown of black silk. Her hair was bound back in a single braid, no jewels or finery. She presented a vision of a once queen cast low. Robert, enthroned as before, read out the charges: high treason, adultery, incest, conspiracy against the crown. Cersei gazed upward at him with unflinching hatred in her eyes. When asked how she pleaded, she said only, "I stand by my children and I stand by my family. Let that be my plea." The herald asked if she would speak in her own defense. She gave a bitter laugh. "What defense is there against a king determined to brand me a whore and a traitor? This so-called trial is a mockery. I demand trial by combat by the ancient laws of the Seven Kingdoms. Let the gods judge. Let me name my champion." Robert's face darkened, but he'd expected this. Ned, from his position beside the throne, said quietly, "By law, your grace, she may name a champion." Robert gave a sharp nod. Cersei's voice rang out, "I name the mountain Ser Gregor Clegane as my champion." A wave of murmurs spread through the throne room. Gregor Clegane was infamous for his brutality, as large as a small giant, unstoppable in battle. But he was not in King's Landing, so the real question was, could she produce him in time? Or would Robert refuse, since Gregor was not present? Robert sneered. "Ser Gregor is nowhere near the city. You'd best choose someone here." Cersei narrowed her eyes. "Then I demand time to send for him." She looked at Ned, then back at Robert. "Surely if you are not afraid, you will give me that courtesy." "I have that right by law." Ned grimaced, for indeed the law did allow an accused to summon their champion if they were not readily available. But giving her that time might be exactly what Tywin Lannister needed to bring his army to the gates. Robert ground his teeth. "Fine," he spat. "You have 2 weeks. If Gregor Clegane has not appeared by then, you must choose another champion or forfeit." A dangerous light gleamed in Cersei's eyes. "I will not forget your mercy, husband." Her tone dripped with sarcasm. The Watchers, uncertain whether to be relieved or more alarmed, slowly dispersed after the hearing. Ned's heart was heavy. 2 weeks was enough time for Tywin to position his forces. Robert might have simply refused, but to refuse a champion outright would make the entire trial by combat a farce, fueling the notion that the king was acting out of pure vengeance rather than following the law. No, best to give her the time, short though it was, and hope that Tywin did not attempt to storm the city or that Gregor was not near enough to arrive in time. But if he did arrive, that fight would be bloody indeed, no matter who the crown named as champion. In the days that followed, tension only mounted. Ravens flew in and out of the Red Keep constantly. Rumors arrived that Tywin's men had sacked villages in the Riverlands, presumably to lure out or threaten House Tully. Ned worried for Catelyn's kin in Riverrun. All across the realm, banners were being called. The North, the Vale, the Reach, the Stormlands. Everyone prepared for war, not knowing who would strike first or how it would unfold. Robert walked the halls like a restless bull, snapping at his council. He demanded that the City Watch keep constant patrol, and that the Royal Navy in Blackwater Bay watch for any sign of Lannister galleys. Peter Baelish tried to reassure him that the Crown's finances could sustain a short war, but if it dragged on, the debts would be ruinous. Varys brought whispers of other claimants stirring. Some suggested that Renly might try to crown himself in the Reach, for he was charming and had the Tyrells' favor. Others whispered that Stannis, notoriously stern, might soon sail from Dragonstone with a fleet. The realm had never been more precarious. Through it all, Ned Stark found a slim sense of vindication. At least the lie had been ripped away. Joffrey was no longer free to torment Sansa or to ascend the throne as a false Baratheon. But the cost was staggering. The entire kingdom teetered on the brink of fracturing. And Ned, who had always hated the Game of Thrones, was forced to play it more intensely than ever. He took counsel with those few he trusted. Ser Barristan, loyal and brave, though sorrowful that he must fight his own sworn brothers. Renly was absent, though. He had left for Highgarden, and Ned wondered if the man might be forging an alliance to press his own claim. Stannis still had not arrived or even responded by Raven. If Stannis truly was the heir, he should come stand beside Robert now. Yet he lingered on Dragonstone. Littlefinger, for his part, drifted in and out, offering cryptic remarks. "Chaos suits some of us quite well," he once said to Ned with a sly smile. Ned had no patience for the man's games. He told Peter to focus on ensuring the Gold Cloaks remained paid and loyal. Baelish, with a mocking bow, said that it would be done, though in truth, Ned could never be certain of the man's duplicity. Meanwhile, the Queen languished in guarded quarters, refusing to speak except to demand that she be allowed to see her children. Robert refused. He declared that the children would stay in separate chambers to limit her influence. Joffrey was locked in a tower room with minimal comforts, still raging. Myrcella and Tommen were in another tower, at least given decent care. The heartbreak of it weighed on Ned. The children, though born of incest, had no blame in any of this. They were innocents caught in the crossfire of great ambitions and betrayals. Then, near the end of the first week, a raven arrived from the Westerlands. A short letter, bearing Tywin Lannister's seal. Ned was with Robert in the Solar when the king broke the seal and read it. Robert's face turned dark as pitch. He read it twice, then flung it at Ned. Ned picked it up and scanned the words. Tywin demanded the immediate release of his daughter and grandchildren, the release of Jaime Lannister, and the recognition of Joffrey as the rightful heir to the throne. Otherwise, Tywin would march on the city, or worse, the letter threatened that the West would secede from the Seven Kingdoms entirely, plunging the realm into chaos. "If my demands are not met," Tywin wrote, "I will have no choice but to avenge my family's honor upon any who stand in my way." Ned handed it back silently, a chill in his heart. "Your Grace, what shall we do?" Robert's answer was a snarl. "We do nothing but sharpen our swords. The old lion can roar, but I'll break his teeth. Send a raven back. If he dares approach with an army, I'll put every Lannister in my cells to death." Ned's stomach twisted. That was precisely the threat that might push Tywin beyond reason. "Perhaps we can negotiate. If we yield Jaime, they might." The king slammed his fist on the table. "No, I will not yield that golden bastard. He fathered those children on my wife. He dishonored me. If Tywin wants him, let him crawl here on his knees and beg for it." Ned closed his eyes, knowing that pride and fury were fueling Robert's decisions. War seemed all but inevitable. The second week of Cersei's waiting period ticked closer to its end. If the mountain arrived, if Tywin's men approached, a single spark could ignite the fires of war around King's Landing. Sure enough, on the 12th day, scouts rode in with word that a large force, perhaps 10,000 strong, carrying Lannister banners, had crossed the Blackwater Rush upriver. They were marching south toward the Gold Road. The city stirred, the watch doubling on the walls. Fear was palpable in the markets, taverns, and alleyways. People recalled the last time an army marched on King's Landing, during Robert's rebellion, when the city had fallen to sack. Those horrors were still fresh in older folks' minds. Robert called his war council. Ned, Barristan, Pycelle, Baelish, and a handful of Crownland's lords attended. The king demanded that the gates be fortified, that men be posted along the walls, that supplies be stockpiled for a possible siege. But the men were uncertain. 10,000 Lannisters might just be a vanguard. Tywin himself was rumored to have an even larger host behind them. The city might need every ally it could muster. In the midst of this turmoil, the final day of Cersei's waiting period arrived. Ser Gregor Clegane had not appeared. Reports claimed he was still raiding near the Riverlands or the Reach. Possibly Tywin had not summoned him in time, or maybe Gregor was still en route. Either way, the day came, and Cersei was brought forth once more. She wore the same black gown, her eyes carrying a quiet determination. Robert was on the throne, Ned at his side. The herald announced that the time had come for the queen to name her champion or forfeit. The hush in the throne room was tense. Cersei's gaze flicked around the hall, searching for any possible champion. None stepped forward. Jaime was locked away. Gregor was not here. Tywin and his army remained outside the city. The watchers hardly breathed. Robert's cruel satisfaction was evident. He smirked. "It seems your champion has abandoned you, dear wife," he said mockingly. "Will you forfeit or fight yourself?" He laughed at the very idea. Cersei was silent for a moment. Then, with a surprising glimmer of a smile, she said, "I have one champion who has come." A murmur of disbelief spread among the watchers. Robert's eyes narrowed. "Who?" She turned, and from the back of the hall stepped Sandor Clegane, the Hound. He had been absent, but now he appeared, wearing battered armor, the scars on his face plain. He bowed stiffly to the king, then turned to Cersei and knelt. "I will fight for the queen's cause." A ripple of shock coursed through the chamber. Sandor had served Joffrey for a time as his sworn shield, but after the revelations, he had vanished. Some said he had deserted. Now it seemed he had not left the city at all, or he had returned in secret. Robert's brow furrowed. "You dare stand for this incestuous traitor?" Sandor's voice was grim. "I stand for the boy, Joffrey. I was his sworn shield. False bastard or not, I gave him my protection once. I'll not stand by and watch him or his mother die without a fight." His eyes flicked to Ned, though not out of any fondness. "I don't care about your laws and claims. I fight for the pup. The rest can burn." Ned felt a chill. Sandor Clegane was formidable, though not as large as his monstrous brother, Gregor. The Hound was no feeble knight. He was a killer, a savage fighter. Ser Barristan had already fought Jaime. Was he to fight again, or did Robert have some other champion in mind? The king scowled. "So be it. We'll have your trial by combat, and you'll die with her, dog." He looked at Barristan, but the old knight stepped forward, face lined with fatigue. "Your Grace, I will fight if that is your command. But I must warn you, I am not as young as I was 3 days ago, and the Hound is formidable." Robert's mouth twisted. He glanced at Ned. "Will you champion the crown, Lord Stark?" Ned hesitated. He was an accomplished fighter, but hardly the realm's greatest. And Sandor was a fearsome foe. Yet how could he decline if the king commanded? He felt a jolt of recollection. The last time he'd fought in single combat was far in the past. He was no green boy, but neither was he a hot-blooded knight. He believed in honor, in justice. If he had to fight, he would. Before Ned could speak, a new voice called out, "I will fight for the king." Ser Loras Tyrell stepped forward. All heads turned. Ned blinked in surprise. Loras had left with Renly, or so he believed. But here the Knight of Flowers stood, clad in shining green and gold armor, face resolute. "I have returned at Lord Renly's bidding," he said quietly, "and I offer my sword to the rightful king." Let me face Sandor Clegane in the king's name. A hush fell. Loras was young and skilled, famously so in tournaments. But Sandor was bigger, far more experienced in real combat. Robert eyed the Tyrell knight with interest. Do you stand with me, boy? Or do you have your own agenda? Loras bowed. My loyalty is to King Robert, until Lord Renly says otherwise. The watchers stirred, uncertain if that was a subtle barb, but the king either did not catch it or did not care. He waved a dismissive hand. Fine, fight him. Barristan stepped aside, relief evident on his face. Ned suspected that Barristan did not want to kill Sandor or be killed by him. Loras and Sandor were escorted to an open space near the dais. Swords were checked for fairness. The watchers gave them a wide berth. Cersei stood off to one side, arms folded, expression confident. The Hound was her last chance to free herself and her children. Loras was the realm's champion in this instance, though many watchers doubted that a flowery knight might outmatch Sandor's deadly skill. They squared off. The hush settled. Robert gave the signal. Sandor wasted no time, launching a brutal assault. Loras parried deftly, but the brute force behind the Hound's strikes drove him back, boots skidding across the marble. Steel rang, and watchers flinched at the intensity. Loras tried to counter, a swift thrust that might have pierced Sandor's side, but the Hound twisted and battered Loras's sword aside with a savage blow. The speed and raw power behind his attacks were daunting. Yet Loras was no mere pretty boy knight. He had faced formidable foes in tournaments, though real battle was different. He recovered quickly, stepping inside Sandor's reach to try a slash at the unarmored gap under the Hound's arm. Sandor grunted as the blade cut through cloth, drawing blood. But the next instant, he slammed his gauntlet fist into Loras's helmet, sending the young knight sprawling. The watchers gasped. Ned felt his heart pound. If the Hound triumphed, Cersei would go free, presumably with Joffrey. That could plunge the city into immediate conflict from within. But Loras, dazed, rolled aside, avoiding a downward chop that might have cleaved his breastplate. He scrambled to his feet, sword up, ready again, though his breath came in ragged pants. Sandor advanced methodically, a grim expression on his scarred face. He slashed left, then right, then a brutal overhead strike. Loras parried each blow, but each one jarred him to the bone. He stepped back, searching for an opening, though each retreat gave Sandor more momentum. The watchers murmured anxiously. Robert leaned forward, eyes glittering with tension. Finally, Loras feinted left, then pivoted around Sandor's right side with a graceful spin, aiming a thrust at the gap in Sandor's armor near the back of his knee. It was a cunning move that might cripple the bigger man. But the Hound, anticipating some trick, whirled faster than expected, blade sweeping down. Sparks flew as Loras's sword was knocked from his hand. A collective cry rose from the watchers as Loras fell heavily to the floor, landing on his side. The Hound pressed forward, sword pointed at Loras's throat. The hush was electric. Cersei's eyes lit with triumph. Robert half stood, fists clenched. Sandor stood over Loras, panting, blood dripping from a shallow wound in his side. "Yield," he growled. Loras looked up, unarmed. His breastplate was battered, his breathing labored. A flicker of defiance crossed his face, and he reached for a dagger at his belt. Sandor kicked it away. The watchers waited, hearts pounding. Ned's hand rested on the pommel of ice, though he knew it would be a breach of all law to interfere in a trial by combat. Loras swallowed, wincing in pain. Slowly, he raised his hand in a sign of surrender, for continuing would be suicide. But that meant, by the rules, that Cersei would be judged innocent if the Hound chose to spare Loras's life. The watchers braced for Robert's explosion. But to the shock of all, Sandor hesitated, sword trembling near Loras's throat. His breath came fast. Then, with a snarl, he tore his sword away from Loras's neck. "I'm no murderer of helpless pups," he spat, stepping back. Loras scrambled away, clumsy in defeat. A wave of confusion washed over the throne room. By law, if the champion for the accused triumphed, The gods had spoken, meaning the accused was innocent of the charges. Or at least such was the tradition of trial by combat. The watchers looked to Robert for a decision. Cersei's voice rang out triumphantly. "The gods have spoken, Robert. Free me at once. Free my son. You cannot deny the old ways." Robert's face turned purple with fury. He glared at Sandor. "You dog," he spat. "You fight for that whore?" Then he turned to Ned. "They expect me to let her go? After what she did? After all that's happened? Gods be damned." Ned placed a hand on Robert's shoulder, trying to calm him. "Your Grace, the law is the law. The Hound has triumphed, and we must abide by it, or we risk losing all legitimacy. If we disregard the gods, the realm will see it as tyranny." Robert trembled with rage, sweat beading on his brow. The watchers waited. Barristan Selmy stepped forward, face solemn. "Your Grace, the law stands. If the Queen's champion has won, then, by the ancient traditions, her guilt is negated in the eyes of the seven." A hush. Robert ground his teeth so loudly it seemed they might crack. He stared at Cersei, who stood with head held high, victory shining in her eyes. The tension was a coiled serpent about to strike. Then Robert let out a massive roar, hurling his goblet against a pillar with such force that the metal rang. "Fine!" he bellowed, chest heaving. "But I am still your king, and I can keep you all locked in your rooms for the rest of your wretched lives." Cersei's smile faltered, but only a little. "You cannot keep me." Robert cut her off. "Yes, I can. Trial by combat might wipe away your guilt in the eyes of the gods. But you are still part of House Lannister, and House Lannister is in open rebellion if Tywin marches. I'll not set you free to conspire with your father. But I'll not kill you, not yet." He snorted. "Guards, take her back to her chambers. She remains my hostage until Tywin stands down." A wave of confusion spread among the watchers. Cersei's face blazed with fury. The Hound bared his teeth. "Then you make a mockery of this entire farce, King," he growled. "If she's innocent, let her go." Robert stabbed a finger at Sandor. "I did not ask you, dog. You've had your victory. Now get out of my sight." Sandor's sword arm tensed. For a moment, it seemed he might attempt something foolish, but the gold cloaks closed in, weapons raised. Cersei calmed him with a look, then let the gold cloaks escort her from the hall. "You will regret this, Robert," she said quietly. "My father is not a man who forgives." Robert scoffed, though the threat sank in. As soon as they were gone, the king turned to the watchers, voice like thunder. "This is still my realm. I will not be toyed with. Let any who defy me suffer the same fate as the Lannisters." Then he stormed from the throne, shoving aside a gold cloak who tried to bow. Barristan followed, looking worried. Ned lingered, feeling the weight of the realm's precarious condition pressing upon him like a mountain of ice. In the days that followed, tension soared to a boiling point. News came that Tywin had arrived near the outskirts of the city with his vanguard, though the main host was still a few days' march behind. He demanded entry under flag of parley to speak with the king about his captive daughter and grandchildren. Robert, maddened by the notion, threatened to kill them if Tywin tried to force his way in. The city readied for siege. People fled in droves, seeking safety in the countryside, though ironically the countryside was full of Lannister men. Others barricaded themselves in their homes, hoarding food. The narrow streets bustled with rumors of an impending sack or a grand battle. Ned pleaded with the king to at least meet Tywin at the city gates under formal truce. "We might still avert war if we speak. If you truly intend to keep them as hostages, perhaps a negotiated settlement can be reached." Robert glared. "They do not deserve negotiation. But, oh fine, I'll speak to the old lion under truce. If he tries anything, I'll kill them all. That's the only thing Tywin respects." They arranged a meeting on the wide plain outside the gates. Barristan, Ned, and 100 gold cloaks accompanied the king, while Tywin rode forth with 200 Lannister knights. The two groups faced each other at arrow's range, uneasy. Robert stepped forward, helm in hand, trying to maintain a regal bearing despite the tension in his eyes. Tywin approached, clad in rich crimson and gold, his face a mask of cold disdain. His green eyes flicked over Robert, Ned, and Barristan. Tywin's first demand was immediate release of Cersei, Joffrey, and the other children. Robert refused. Tywin offered gold, offered a marriage alliance to legitimize the union if needed, some outlandish suggestion that could quell rumors of incest if it was recognized by the High Septon. Robert spat in disgust. Tywin threatened a siege. Robert threatened to execute the hostages if Tywin attacked. The standstill was absolute. Ned tried to intervene. "My lord, you cannot deny your daughter broke faith with the king, but the trial by combat." Tywin cut him off with a glare. "My daughter is innocent in the eyes of the gods, Stark. You and your precious king break every custom that stands, ignoring the verdict for your own vengeful ends. Release her." Robert's fury mounted. "I will not. She remains a threat to my crown. You want her? Kneel and swear fealty. Accept that Joffrey is no heir. Confess her adultery. Then I might let her live out her days in exile." Tywin bared his teeth in something that might have been a parody of a smile. "You overestimate your position, your grace. We are 2 days from your walls with a force thrice the size of your city watch. If you harm my grandchildren, I promise the city will burn. You cannot hold off an entire host forever." Robert was unmoved. "Try me." Tywin's face was cold as winter. "Very well, war it is." He turned and rode away with his knights, leaving Robert trembling with rage. Ned felt despair sink into his bones. War was now all but certain. They rode back into the city behind the spiked portcullis of the King's Gate, the lines of gold cloaks bracing for a siege. The city's bells tolled ominously. In the Red Keep, Cersei learned of Tywin's approach and smiled with satisfaction. She told the guards that they should beg for mercy while they could. Meanwhile, Robert drank himself to a stupor that night. Ned tried to keep order, to organize defenses, and to calm the small council. But half the council had fled, and the other half squabbled. Peter Baelish spoke of possibly bribing Sellsword companies to bolster the city's defenses. Pycelle wrung his hands, calling for some arrangement with Tywin. Varys silently observed, occasionally dropping a subtle hint that the city might starve under siege, or that certain rebellious elements inside the walls might open the gates from within. Ned Stark sat alone late at night in the solar, studying maps by candlelight. He reflected on how a single choice to reveal the truth publicly had shaped everything that followed. If he had tried a quieter approach, perhaps events would have proceeded differently. Perhaps Robert might have died on his hunt, or Cersei might have fled with her children, and the realm could have avoided a direct confrontation. Or perhaps the war would have come anyway, just more slowly. It was impossible to say. All he knew was that House Stark stood for honor and truth, and he would not have done it differently. If war came, he would meet it with all the grim resolve of the North. Another raven had arrived that night, from Winterfell. Robb Stark wrote that the Northern Bannermen were gathering, uncertain if they should march south. The boy was barely 15, forced to shoulder adult responsibilities. Ned's heart ached for his son, but perhaps the North's strength might yet be needed. The Tullus in the Riverlands also prepared for war, especially with Lannister raids on their lands. Walder Frey sat on the twins, presumably waiting to see who offered him the better bargain. The Eyrie under Lisa Arryn was silent, as always, with Catelyn also in the Vale. The realm was a patchwork of tensions, ready to ignite. As the siege began the next day, the gold cloaks sealed the city gates. Tywin's forces spread out, encircling King's Landing at a cautious distance. Archers lined the walls. Ballistae were set at strategic points. The river to the north was blocked by Lannister camps, though Robert's ships in Blackwater Bay might still supply the city, so there was some relief. But the lines of Lannister men outside grew each day as more bannermen arrived. War horns sounded at dawn and dusk. The people huddled behind the walls in fear. Robert refused to bend. Tywin refused to yield. Cersei and her children remained captives, with only the Hound in the city to defend her if something changed. Jaime languished in a dungeon, the rightful prisoner of the king. And so it was that the Seven Kingdoms slid into a new cataclysm, a war born not of old Targaryen claims, but of Lannister pride and Baratheon fury, unleashed by the cold truth that Ned Stark had dared to speak beneath the vaulted ceilings of the throne room. For the days and weeks and months to come, that truth, and the war that followed, would reshape the political landscape of Westeros far more profoundly than any single lie might have. The realm's greatest lords would soon choose sides. Battles would be waged on fields once peaceful, and houses would rise or fall with the shifting tide of bloodshed. Through it all, Ned Stark would cling to his honor and pray that, when the final dust settled, the realm might find a measure of peace rooted in truth rather than deception. But for now, as the first catapults arrived in Tywin's siege lines, hurling stones against the walls, and as Robert mustered his courage atop the battlements, sword in hand, the only certainty was that no one could fully foresee how this war would end, or who would pay the ultimate price. If they had known, perhaps even Robert might have paused. Perhaps even Tywin might have relented. Perhaps even Cersei might have pleaded for genuine mercy. But in the Game of Thrones, truth is only the beginning of the storm. No one escapes unscathed, and so the city braced for a siege. The banners of the stag flew from the Red Keep, and the lion crouched beyond the walls, sharpening its claws, determined to reclaim what it believed was rightfully its own. No matter the cost in blood, the days stretched into a grim tapestry of fear and steel. The walls of King's Landing bristled with spears and archers, and the small folk whispered that the lion had come to devour the stag. Some said that the city's ultimate destruction was near at hand, that Tywin Lannister's army would break down the gates any day. Others held out hope that the king's ships in Blackwater Bay and the king's own ferocity might preserve the capital. It did not help that King Robert's moods swung from fury to dark despair in the space of an evening. Ned Stark woke before dawn on the 8th day of the siege. The skies were overcast, tinged with a pale, sickly light, and from the walls he could see the Lannister outriders patrolling just beyond the arrow range. He had hardly slept these past nights, roused by alarms real or imagined, by the tension that rippled through the Red Keep. But winter's chill calm had settled in his bones, lending him a kind of grim steadiness. He visited the king's solar first, only to find Robert had left at daybreak to inspect the gate defenses. After that, Ned made for the ramparts, armed with his long sword and wearing a thick cloak against the wind. He ascended the steps to the top of the walls near the King's Gate, where the city's main defenses were concentrated. From here, he could see beyond the trenches that the gold cloaks had dug, out to the fields and hills dotted with 1,000 campfires, all belonging to Tywin's forces. The hiss of a torch flaring bright caught his attention. A watchman had just set fresh oil on a brazier near a catapult. The big war machine stood silent for now, aimed at a cluster of tents in the distance. The watchman turned as Ned appeared and offered a stiff bow, calling him "My Lord Hand." Ned inclined his head in acknowledgement. He gazed out on that wide ring of threats. All those men, mustering in shining crimson and gold livery, the standard of the lion snapping in the breeze. From the city's vantage, it was impossible to say precisely how many thousands Tywin commanded. Scouts had placed the number somewhere around 30,000, perhaps more, enough to envelop the city from multiple sides and choke off most roads, though Robert still held the sea. It was a formidable blockade. No attacks had come thus far, save for a few feints near the gate. Tywin was too cunning to hurl his men against tall walls when he might starve the city or provoke Robert into some rash sally. In the meantime, Robert had threatened repeatedly to execute his captives if Tywin dared attack. Jaime remained in the dungeons, recovering from the wound Barristan had given him. Cersei was held in guarded chambers, together with Myrcella and Tommen. Joffrey had been placed in a separate tower. Robert believed it best to divide them so none might conspire too easily. And of course, Ned thought with a sigh, that arrangement also satisfied Robert's appetite for humiliation. Every time Ned passed the tower where Joffrey was held, the guards told him the boy raged and spat curses. Now and then Ned felt pity. Despite Joffrey's cruelty, he was only a boy, shaped by the warped environment of the Red Keep. Still, Ned had a realm to think about. Pity was a luxury measured carefully. As he stood on the ramparts, footsteps sounded on stone behind him, and Ser Barristan Selmy appeared, wearing his white cloak over shining mail. He gave Ned a respectful nod. "My Lord Hand," he said quietly, stepping up to share Ned's vantage over the Lannister camps. "Any movement?" "Nothing new," Ned replied. "Their outriders circle like wolves, but they keep their distance. No sign of Tywin himself." Barristan's features were etched with worry. "Our men stand ready, but a siege is a cruel business. Morale will erode in time." Ned well knew it. King's Landing was no small castle that might hold out for years on well-stocked cellars. This was the largest city in the Seven Kingdoms, teeming with tens of thousands of mouths to feed. Robert had commanded that the gates be sealed, so there was no question of letting more small folk flee. Some had left in the early days, but many more had not. The city was packed with merchants, artisans, beggars, cut-purses, and children, all of whom would need bread and water. Even with the Blackwater Bay still open for trade, fear choked the normal flow of goods, and the city's finances were in disarray. War was never cheap. Ned turned to Barristan. "Have the king's counselors responded to my request about rationing?" Barristan sighed. "Pycelle complains that the granaries are insufficient. Baelish claims that with enough coin we can import grain from Myr or Pentos, but that requires safe passage across the narrow sea, and Tywin's fleet might cut us off if they sail around Dorne. The king, he does not enjoy hearing these logistical concerns." Ned's lips pressed into a thin line. Robert had never been one for the dull details of governance. "We must do our best. If we cannot feed the small folk, we risk riots." Barristan nodded. "I know. We'll need to conscript some of the wealthier merchants into providing bread or risk losing the city from within before Tywin lifts a finger." A movement on the horizon drew their attention. A column of riders approached from the west, bearing the lion banner. Neither Ned nor Barristan spoke as they watched the approach. The riders stopped well short of arrow range, apparently content to watch the city walls. Possibly they were a patrol or some lesser band of knights testing the city's vigilance. Ned finally tore his gaze away. "I'll confer with the king. Will you join me?" Barristan nodded. The two men descended from the walls, passing a ring of pikes stacked neatly by the parapet. The gold cloaks parted to let them through. The stairwell led down into the city, where the stench of so many souls living in close quarters fouled the air. King's Landing had always smelled of sweat and rot, a pot of rancid stew. Under siege, it was worse. Refugees clustered near the Gate District, still hoping they might slip out. The watch had driven them back forcibly with more than a few injuries. Ned did not pause to linger among the crowds. He and Barristan made for the Red Keep, walking swiftly through winding streets. The presence of the white-cloaked Lord Commander was enough to keep most trouble at bay, though hungry eyes tracked them. On a corner, an old woman hawked stale bread for a price that made Ned's stomach twist. Next to her, a man with a donkey cart sold half-rotten vegetables at exorbitant rates. By the time Ned and Barristan reached the Red Keep, the sun had climbed higher, staining the sky a pale gold. The keep itself stood proud, a fortress of red stone perched above the sea. Gold cloaks guarded the main gates, letting them pass into the courtyard. Inside, the tension was no less palpable. Knights hurrying this way and that, stewards rushing with messages, the distant clash of swords from the yard where men drilled in half-armor. In the grand entry hall, Ned parted briefly from Barristan to speak with a messenger from the Vale. The man bowed, presented a letter, and then left quickly. Ned skimmed the parchment. A curt note from Lisa Arryn. She claimed that the Vale would not march. She had no intention of endangering her son, the young Lord Robert Arryn, in a war for or against the Lannisters. Essentially, the Eyrie would remain aloof. Ned's heart sank further. The realm was fracturing under the weight of old grudges and fear. He found Robert in the library antechamber, though the king hardly looked like a man studying books. He paced back and forth, wide-bodied in his heavy fur cloak, trailing the smell of sweat. His brow glistened, Standing by the fireplace was Lord Peter Baelish in fine embroidered attire, arms folded. Nearby, Lord Varys hovered, fingers steepled, a concerned expression painted across his face. At Ned's arrival, Robert spun. "Where have you been, Ned?" he demanded. "Riders at the gates, men crossing the fields. Tywin plays with us. What does he want?" "He wants his daughter and grandchildren freed. He wants Jaime returned," Ned said quietly. "He wants you to name Joffrey your heir or face the consequences." Robert snarled. "He'll never get that. That whelp is no son of mine. I'll see the lot of them dead before I let them steal my throne." Baelish cleared his throat in a delicate manner. "We might consider a ransom for the children, at least Myrcella and Tommen. A good faith gesture, so to speak." "Never," Robert barked. "They're as false as the rest." Ned took a moment to steady himself before speaking. "Your Grace, if we keep them all, we must accept that Tywin will do anything to break our lines eventually. The city's resources are not limitless." "And if I release them," Robert said, "Tywin will have his precious daughter back, and we'll lose any leverage we have." "Don't spout nonsense, Ned. I'm no fool." Ned did not press. He knew that in Robert's current mood, reason was in short supply. Instead, he studied the expressions of the others. Peter Baelish wore that half-smile that always hinted at hidden agendas. Varys clasped his hands together and said smoothly, "Your Grace, the city folk grow restless. Whispers speak of a riot if bread remains scarce. Perhaps we should lighten the taxes, or open the king's granaries." Robert's eyes blazed. "My granaries? And how long will that feed them, eunuch?" "A fortnight, if that." "And then what?" Varys dipped his head. "Only a suggestion. The small folk are the city's lifeblood. They must not come to loathe their king." Robert grunted and looked away, jaw set. "Speaking of loathing, Tywin's outriders are scouring the roads. We need to set an ambush. Let them learn we are not so easily starved out. Perhaps we can capture a few of his knights, put them in the black cells with Jaime. That might make him think twice." Ned did not like the notion. Raids and ambushes would only stoke Tywin's anger further and invite retaliation against the city. Then again, they were already in the midst of a siege. A handful of skirmishes might not worsen the situation. Baelish, reading Ned's silence, ventured, "We'll need a bold commander to lead such raids, someone the men can rally behind. Someone—" "Oh, perhaps Lord Stark." Ned shook his head. "My duty is to manage the city's defense from within, and to keep the king safe. I cannot wander about the countryside on raids." Robert's gaze snapped to him. "Then who?" "Barristan is half the city's heart, too old to chase outriders day and night. Lancel? The boy is worthless." "Lancel Lannister was some cousin of the Queen, a squire, hardly more. My brother Renly is away in the Reach. Stannis hides on Dragonstone. Who the hell do I have left?" The words hammered home how ill-prepared Robert was to face a major siege. His old companions from the rebellion were scattered or gone. Jon Arryn, dead. Hoster Tully, ill and in the Riverlands. Eddard Stark, yes, but Ned was Hand of the King and had no illusions that if he rode out, the city might be left rudderless. Baelish coughed politely. "There is the Kingsguard, such as Ser Meryn, Ser Aerys, perhaps not the cream of the crop. Or the Hound, though he's turned coat in a fashion. Actually, I do wonder about Sandor Clegane. He remains in the city, does he not, loitering near the Queen's rooms?" Robert's face darkened. "The dog. He's sworn to that incestuous brood. He's not to be trusted." Ned thought back to the trial by combat. Sandor had emerged as champion for Cersei, vanquished Ser Loras, and forced the city's law to declare her innocent of the charges, at least in the eyes of the gods. Yet Robert still held her as a hostage to Tywin's good behavior. It was a twisted game. Sandor had only fought for Joffrey and the Queen because he felt some twisted sense of duty, or so it seemed. Since then, he'd lurked around the Red Keep, no friend to the king, but not an active foe either. Seeing the king's look of contempt, Baelish merely smiled thinly. "In that case, we lack a ready champion for raiding. Perhaps we can pay Sellswords from the free cities. We have gold, assuming the crown can borrow more coin. Ned grimaced, turning to Robert. Your Grace, any attempt at raiding might yield a small advantage, but Tywin's host is too large to pick apart easily. Our best course may be to force a negotiation for at least the release of Myrcella and Tommen. Keep Joffrey and Cersei as your key hostages if you must, but letting the two younger children go might reduce Tywin's fury. Robert's expression contorted, torn between anger and doubt. Finally, he pointed a thick finger at Ned. By the gods, man, if I yield them an inch, they'll take a mile. If I let Myrcella and Tommen go, Tywin will only want the rest. He'll see me as weak. That is the risk, Ned conceded. But at least it might open a path for negotiation. Right now, we are at a stalemate. A stalemate that can't last, Baelish murmured. Once the harvest in the Reach is done, the Tyrells might pick a side. Or your brother Stannis might, Robert growled. Stannis is a damned craven for not responding to my summons. Maybe he hopes I'll die behind these walls, so he can take the throne for himself. Ned tensed at that. He still remembered that, by rights, if Robert died childless, the crown should pass to Stannis. Robert had raged about the possibility that Stannis might be building a rival claim. But the king's own hatred of the Lannisters overshadowed everything else at present. A hush settled as the king lapsed into brooding silence. Varys cleared his throat softly and spoke in his unctuous tone. If I may, your grace, there is word from the north that Robb Stark and his bannermen have begun marching south. Perhaps they mean to come to the aid of Lord Stark here in King's Landing, or perhaps they intend to defend the Riverlands. In either case, a new army on the fields could shift the balance. Ned felt a lurch in his heart. So Robb was indeed marching. He had commanded the boy to gather the northern bannermen only if it became necessary. War must have appeared inevitable, or else Robb would have stayed behind. For a moment, Ned's thoughts turned to winter snows, to the old gods in their silent godswood, to his sons and daughters left in Winterfell. Yet Robb was practically a man grown now, forced by the cruelty of events to play at war. Robert rubbed his beard. The North will be welcome if they come to break the siege. But if Tywin intercepts them first, well, maybe that will keep the old lion busy. Ned stiffened. He did not want his people used as bait in some larger game. I will send a raven to Robb urging caution. If he tries to force the Trident or the King's Road in open battle against Tywin's host, it could be disastrous. Ha! Robert said. You truly are your father's son, Ned. Always cautious. Well, do as you must. But if the North arrives in time, it may be exactly what we need. Baelish clicked his tongue. If they arrive in time, traveling from Winterfell to King's Landing can be many long weeks on foot, especially in uncertain weather. No one had more to say on that. The conversation ended with Robert deciding that, for now, they would hold their defenses and keep watch for any sign that Tywin intended a direct assault. Ned inwardly dreaded the prospect that the Lannisters might starve the city out. But he saw little recourse. He took his leave, his mind churning with concerns. Once outside the Solar, he paused in the corridor and sighed heavily. That was when he noticed Varys lingering in the shadows, as he so often did. The eunuch drifted closer, a faint sympathetic smile on his lips. Lord Stark, Varys said in a hushed voice, you bear a great burden. If I might offer a word of counsel. I am listening, Ned said, though warily. Varys lowered his voice further. If the king does not relent, if Tywin does not relent, the small folk will suffer a dreadful famine. Already, bread prices soar, and the gold cloaks cannot quell every riot. If the city starves, there will be bloodshed. It may turn ugly, as it did under the Mad King when the crowds howled for food. And what would you have me do? Ned asked, though he guessed the answer. Persuade the king to permit negotiations. Or, if the king will not be swayed, perhaps you might find a means to smuggle Myrcella and Tommen out of the city. A secret release, call it a cunning gesture. Tywin might then see that we are not monsters, that we do not intend to harm children. That alone might slow his hand. Ned frowned. You propose defying the king's orders behind his back. That is treason. Varys gave a tight-lipped smile. One might call it that, but one might also call it mercy for two children who are truly innocent in all this. They were not the ones who bedded each other, after all. He paused, letting that settle. The choice, of course, is yours. I do not envy you. Without waiting for a response, Varys bowed and drifted away. Ned stood there, feeling the weight of it all pressing on him like a millstone. He was the hand of the king, Robert's friend and confidant. Yet each day it grew harder to reconcile Robert's fury with the realm's best interests. Would it be so terrible to free Myrcella and Tommen? But how could he do so without the king's approval? And what would Robert do if he discovered the betrayal? With a heavy heart, Ned decided to visit Sansa and Arya. The notion of seeing his daughters offered a small glimmer of solace. He had them under watch, not quite house arrest, but security was tight in the Red Keep. The hallway that led to their chambers was guarded by 4 men of the North, all loyal to House Stark. They bowed as Ned approached. Inside, the bedchamber was tidy, the morning light streaming through tall, shuttered windows. Sansa sat by the window seat, pale with worry, while Arya knelt by the table, her practiced sword Needle lying across her lap. They both rose at once when their father entered. "Father," Arya said, rushing forward. She still clung to her tomboy ways, wearing breeches even though the maids scolded her. "Have you heard anything new? Will there be a battle?" Ned put a hand on her shoulder. "There may be, Arya. Do not worry yourself with that now." Sansa rose more slowly, folding her hands before her. "We heard shouting in the halls last night, and men talking of the Lannisters surrounding the city. Is it true?" He nodded, pushing aside his sorrow at her wide-eyed fear. "Yes, they are beyond the walls, but the King's Landing walls are strong, and the King commands many men. We are safe here for the time being." Sansa glanced out the window, where she might see smoke rising from distant campfires. "What of the prince?" she asked haltingly, as if unsure what to call Joffrey now that the truth had been exposed. Ned exhaled. "He remains confined. He is not your betrothed any longer, Sansa." Color touched her cheeks. "I know. I am grateful truly, for I see what a monster he is, but I feel pity as well." "Is it strange that I pity him?" Ned's gaze softened. "No, my dear daughter. I suppose it's not strange at all." Arya muttered. "I don't pity him. I hope he rots." "Arya," Ned scolded gently. "He is still just a boy, and war spares no one." She lowered her eyes, but stubbornness danced across her features. She changed the subject. "Are you going to send us away? You said once we might have to leave." Ned hesitated, recalling how he had originally planned to whisk them away if trouble arose. But the city gates were sealed now, and the roads were lined with Lannisters. Smuggling them out would be difficult. "For the time being, you will remain here under guard. Keep your eyes open, but do not roam freely. I'll not have you wandering the alleys where riots might break out." Arya made a face, but Sansa nodded meekly. Ned gave them each a parting embrace, feeling the tension in their slim shoulders. By the time he left, he felt wearier than ever. He returned to the council chamber, met with Pycelle about the stocks of grain and barley. The news was all grim. There were perhaps 4 weeks of guaranteed rations for the city's core population, 5 if they have daily allotments. Longer if the wealthy parted with their private reserves, but that was not a notion that would go over easily. Baelish drifted in, discussing coin to hire cell sales or bribe passing merchants to bring food. The mood was dire. Ned withdrew at midday for a quick meal of bread and salt fish, then found himself drawn to the corridor leading to Cersei's quarters. The Queen's rooms, once plush and majestic, were now her cage. For gold cloaks stood guard at the door, their expressions uneasy as Ned approached. "My Lord Hand," one said. "She's not to leave without the King's approval." "I know," Ned said. "I mean to speak with her. Let me pass." After a moment's hesitation, they opened the door for him. Inside, the spacious solar still smelled faintly of perfumed oils and scented candles. but the drapes had been torn down, the furniture shoved aside to make room for a small pallet where Myrcella and Tommen slept. Cersei herself stood by the window, gazing out at the distant campfires. She wore a simple green gown, her golden hair loose down her back, a tarnished beauty overshadowed by the hardness in her eyes. When she heard Ned's entry, she did not immediately turn, but her posture stiffened. Tommen sat on the floor, paging through a dusty book, glancing up at Ned with innocent eyes. Myrcella was reading as well, perched on a small stool. They both looked frightened, exhausted by captivity. Cersei finally faced him. "Lord Stark," she said, voice icily poised. "I see you've come to gloat, or perhaps to torment us further." Ned studied her face, searching for some trace of regret. "Neither. I came to speak with you. Tywin is outside the gates. War looms." She brushed a hand through her hair. "Yes, so I've heard through the walls. My father will not leave us here. He will do what he must." "You realize thousands could die," Ned said quietly. "Men, women, children. And you will still be locked here, with no guarantee of your father's victory. The king is content to let the city starve." She arched a brow. "Is that your concern, or the king's? Since you're wearing the Hands badge, I imagine it troubles you that he might burn the city out of sheer spite. But it's not my problem. I did not ask to be locked up. We had a trial. My champion prevailed, yet here I remain. You know as well as I do that a single trial by combat cannot undo the realm's laws regarding the succession," Ned said. "Robert will never accept Joffrey as his heir, nor will he let you free to conspire with your father." Cersei's lips curled. "Then let him kill me, or perhaps kill my children. He's threatened it often enough. If he does so, my father's vengeance will be swift and terrible." "Is that what you want, Ned Stark?" He tightened his jaw. He could sense the rage simmering in her. "I would spare your children if I could," he admitted, surprising himself with the sincerity. "I do not relish their suffering." Cersei turned away, a small scoff escaping her. Then she cast a brief glance at Myrcella and Tommen. The children were watching, anxious. She moved closer to Ned, lowering her voice. "If you truly wish them spared, set them free. Let them go to my father. I will remain if that's what it takes." Ned did not blink. It was precisely the idea Varys had mooted. But to do so without the king's blessing would be an act of treason. "If I did, the king would see it as betrayal," he said quietly. "He might execute you or me or both for it." A faint, mocking smile crossed Cersei's lips. "Would that be so terrible?" Before Ned could answer, Myrcella spoke timidly from her stool. "Mother, who is that?" She looked up at Ned with wide hazel eyes. Cersei stiffened, glancing over her shoulder. "That is Lord Stark, the king's hand," she said. "He helps keep us here." Myrcella bit her lip, looking down. Tommen mumbled, "He's the father of Sansa and Arya, right?" Ned nodded gently. "Yes, I am." He approached the children, kneeling to their level. Tommen looked so young, perhaps 8 or 9, plump-cheeked, hair bright as gold. Myrcella was older, but no less innocent in her bearing. Ned felt a pang. They were truly children, caught in an adult's war of pride and lineage. "I'm sorry," he murmured, not quite sure why he said it. Cersei's eyes narrowed, suspicious. She touched Myrcella's shoulder, as though to guard her daughter from him. "You say that, but it does no good. Why did you come here?" "Because I wanted to see if any accord could be reached," Ned said. "A way to spare more lives." She laughed softly, a bitter sound. "You think I have that power? I am a prisoner. The only power I have is the threat of my father's wrath." Ned rose. "It seems we are at an impasse, then." "Indeed," she said. "But if you truly want to show mercy, release my children at least. Let Tommen and Myrcella go. After all, it's Joffrey your king hates, yes." Her gaze was sharp. "That would be a step. And if Robert is half as honorable as you claim, he might let them go without punishing you." "Might." Ned glanced at the children once more, saw Myrcella's small hands trembling. "I will think on it," he said at length. I cannot promise anything. Cersei did not reply, merely giving him a curt nod. He turned to leave, but she spoke again, voice quiet. Lord Stark. He paused. If you do nothing, I assure you Tywin Lannister will come in force. This city will drown in blood. Is that what you want on your conscience? He did not answer. Outside in the corridor, he exhaled shakily. The faint light of a torch cast shadows along the wall. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight settle. If this war went on, tens of thousands might die. The laws of men demanded that Joffrey not inherit, that Cersei and Jaime's treason be punished. But the children, Myrcella and Tommen, truly were blameless. Was it right to keep them caged? He forced himself to continue along the corridor. Dwelling on it would do no good just yet. Perhaps if the city's position deteriorated enough, Robert might be forced to relent. Ned only prayed that it did not require such extreme desperation. A new crisis emerged the following morning. A column of smoke rose from Flea Bottom, the slum district near the base of Visenyas Hill. Word raced through the Red Keep that a riot had broken out. Some said it was triggered by bread prices, others by rumors that the king hoarded grain for himself. By midday, the Gold Cloaks had formed a cordon around the area, and Ned was summoned to quell the unrest. He and a dozen men of House Stark, along with a contingent of City Watch, rode down into Flea Bottom's narrow alleys. The stench was overwhelming, the noise deafening. Hundreds of hungry small folk milled about, some brandishing clubs or old knives. Charred remains of stalls lined the main street. A Gold Cloak officer rode up to Ned in a panic, explaining that the people had begun looting shops suspected of hoarding food. Ned dismounted, wincing at the swirl of ash in the air. He ordered the City Watch to form a shield wall and push the rioters back. Shouts rose from the crowd. Bread for the poor! Curse the king! We starve while the lords feast. It took a concerted effort to keep the crowd from surging forward. Ned climbed atop a broken cart, raising both hands. Listen to me, he bellowed, voice echoing. I am Eddard Stark, the Hand of the King. I swear to you we are doing what we can to bring food into the city. Violence will not help. Go back to your homes. The crowd jeered. A woman shouted, Lies! The king keeps all the loaves in the Red Keep while our children starve. Another man roared, We want the Lannister devil children dead. Let them eat their own gold. Ned's blood ran cold at the hatred that sparked in their eyes. If Robert's hold on the city was this frail, then it would not take much to push them into open revolt. Desperation made men bold and cruel. He signaled the watch to hold their ground. A stone whistled past, narrowly missing Ned's head. Another soared from the crowd, striking a Gold Cloak shield. The watchman braced. Steady, Ned commanded. If they charged, the riot might become a slaughter. The tension was unbearable. Then the same Gold Cloak officer who had approached earlier stepped forward with Ned, calling for calm. Somehow, between Ned's appeals and the watch's disciplined presence, the crowd began to disperse, though not without rancor. Flames still licked at a few wooden stalls, but the worst of the riot sputtered out. By the time Ned left Flea Bottom that afternoon, he felt ill, as though a disease of unrest had begun to fester. Could happen again tomorrow or the next day. The city was a tinderbox. He reported all this to Robert, who sat in the great hall gnawing on a roast leg of lamb. A hush fell as Ned described the anger among the small folk, the fear, the hunger. Robert's jaw clenched. He pounded the arm of his chair. Damn them! I'm their king, and I'll feed them if I can. Let them wait a bit more. A bit more, Ned repeated, struggling to keep calm. Your Grace, we must bring in more supplies, or at least ration what we have in a structured way. Perhaps you can take some from the noble houses who have hidden stores, the Tyrell shipments, or the granaries of the faith. Robert's lip curled. You want me to go hat in hand to the High Septon, or to the Tyrells? The Tyrells are not our friends right now. They're probably sniffing around to see which side benefits them more. And the faith, well, maybe. Fine, do as you must. Ned took that as permission enough. He swiftly arranged for the gold cloaks to begin searching for hidden caches of grain among merchants who had hoarded. Baelish was assigned to track the finances. Still, it was a meager solution. The city teemed with too many mouths. On the 7th day of siege came a fresh shock. A single raven from Stannis Baratheon. Ned opened the parchment with Robert standing beside him in the council chamber. Stannis's words were curt. "To my brother, the king, and his hand, I have heard rumor of trouble in King's Landing. Let it be known that I intend to sail with my fleet to the Blackwater to restore the king's peace. If my presence is unwelcome, say so, and I shall remain on Dragonstone. If it is desired, I come with 100 ships and men enough to break any blockade." Stannis Baratheon. Robert grunted at the note. So Stannis has grown a spine. Took him long enough. Ned read it again. 100 ships could indeed challenge Tywin's blockade from the sea. If he can land men behind Tywin's lines. Robert's eyes gleamed. Yes, we might smash the Lannisters in a pincer. That would be something. But I'll not have him lord over me in my own city. He's always been too stiff-necked, too righteous. Ned kept his voice steady. He is your brother, and the lawful next in line if you have no heir. Robert glared, though not with the old hostility. I know. Fine. Send a raven back. Tell him his presence is welcome, but that I remain king. Ned inclined his head. It was a small sign of progress. Perhaps Stannis's arrival might turn the tide. Or perhaps it would only stoke new tensions about who truly deserved the throne if Robert fell. In either case, it was better than total isolation. But Tywin Lannister would not sit idle. Indeed, within days, they learned that a sizable Lannister fleet patrolled the waters off Crackclaw Point, prepared to intercept any ships that tried to resupply the city. Naval conflict loomed, and Ned prayed that Stannis's renowned skill at sea might outmatch the Lannisters. While the city waited, the tension soared. Another riot broke out near the fish market. This one was bloodier, with 3 gold cloaks and a half-dozen rioters dead. Robert considered unleashing the Kingsguard to slaughter the rabble, but Ned counseled caution. The streets seethed with discontent. In the midst of that roiling crisis, Ned found himself again speaking with Varys, who cornered him in a deserted corridor near the council chamber. The eunuch's soft slippers made no sound as he approached. His eyes glittered with sympathy. "Lord Stark," he said in a hushed voice. "The city is on the brink. Every moment we delay, Tywin's noose tightens. May I suggest a bold stroke?" Ned was weary, leaning against the cool stone wall. "I am listening." Varys's voice dropped lower. "Release Myrcella and Tommen at once. Smuggle them out by ship to Tarth or some other place where Lord Tywin can collect them peacefully. Let it be known that the king spares children." Ned rubbed his temple. "Robert will never agree. And so we do it without his consent, for the good of the realm. You risk a quick, ugly death if you're found out." Varys offered a small bow. "I am aware of the risks, but if you aid me, perhaps we can do it quietly. The night is dark. The harbor is large. There are always smugglers for hire." Ned's heart pounded. He recalled Cersei's fervent wish that he free the younger children. He recalled the city's hunger and the rage in Tywin's camp. Perhaps such a mercy would truly ease the siege. But the king, Robert, would see it as the worst betrayal. "I cannot," he said at last, though the words felt as though they carved out a piece of his soul. "Not yet. Let me try once more to persuade Robert openly." Varys's sigh was barely audible. "Time is short, Lord Stark. The city burns while you wrestle with honor." Ned turned away, but the eunuch's words stung. Honor was indeed the question. Did a lord's honor demand loyalty to his king's commands, or mercy for innocent children, or the salvation of the entire city? He felt Lyanna's memory flicker in his mind, the heartbreak that had spurred Robert's rebellion. So many thousands had died then. Now they stood at the brink of another cataclysm. That evening, Ned sought Robert in his private chambers. The king was half drunk, sprawled on a cushioned chair with a flagon of ale, frowning at the flickering fire in the hearth. The chamber stank of stale sweat and spilled liquor. Ned gently dismissed the servants, wanting to speak to Robert alone. "Ned," Robert said, not looking up, "come to nag me again about bread for the small folk?" Ned closed the door. "Not tonight. I've come to speak of Myrcella and Tommen." Robert grunted. "What of them? There's no reason to keep them. Joffrey and Cersei, yes, you claim they deserve punishment. But the younger children are innocent. Tywin's entire fury rests on fear for his family. If you released Myrcella and Tommen—" "Never," Robert said, his voice low with menace. "Never. I told you I won't let them slip away. If Tywin wants them, let him yield first." "He will not," Ned insisted. "You know that. He sees them as reason enough to starve and sack this city. Countless innocents will die. Is your vengeance on Cersei worth that?" Robert's face purpled. He lurched upright, nearly stumbling. "Vengeance? This is justice, Ned. She humiliated me. She cuckolded me with her own brother. For the god's sake. She gave me no true heir. And you talk of letting her whelps roam free?" Ned stood firm. "I beg you to show mercy, for the realm's sake. If not both, then at least let Tommen go. Or Myrcella. Show Tywin a gesture. Show the city a gesture that you are not a butcher." A shudder ran through Robert's thick frame. He turned away, gripping the mantle of the fireplace. The flames danced over his features. After a tense moment, his words emerged slurred by ale and bitterness. "I cannot, Ned, I cannot. If I do that, I show weakness. The next day, Tywin demands Jaime's release or Joffrey's release, or demands I name Joff bastard or rightful heir, or the seven only know what else. I'll not unravel everything. No, they remain where they are, or I'll kill them all if Tywin forces me." Ned's shoulders slumped. "Then war is certain." Robert's big hand squeezed the mantle so hard his knuckles turned white. "Let it come." Ned left him there, feeling as though the last hope for a negotiated peace had slipped between his fingers. The next day, news arrived like a thunderbolt. Stannis' fleet had engaged a portion of the Lannister navy off Massey's Hook, sinking several ships and scattering the rest. Then Stannis landed a force near Rosby, inside the Crownlands, threatening to sweep toward King's Landing from the north while Tywin's main camp was west. It was the first major sign that the siege might be broken. Robert went nearly mad with joy when he heard, "Yes, my brother's finally showing the Lannisters how real men fight." He thundered about the Red Keep, roaring with laughter and slapping men on the back. The court swelled with hope. Even Ned felt a momentary lift in his spirits. If Stannis approached from the north, Tywin's blockade might be forced to split. But Tywin was no fool. The day after Stannis landed, Lannister outriders withdrew from the city's eastern roads and regrouped in the west, close to the main host. Rumor said that Tywin was considering a forced march to intercept Stannis before he could link up with the city. Yet Stannis' men traveled light, and by the time Tywin made a move, Stannis could be at the city gates. A fortnight crawled by, filled with anxious nights and tense days. Skirmishes flared outside the walls. Robert, itching for battle, led a sally one morning, charging out of the king's gate with 300 gold cloaks and a handful of knights. They encountered a Lannister patrol of about 100 men. The king personally smashed through them, slaying half a dozen. The rest fled. Robert returned to the gates drenched in blood, triumphant. Yet it was a trifling victory, and the Lannisters closed ranks after that. In Flea Bottom, more riots erupted. Food was scarce, prices soared, and rumors claimed the king would keep everything for the Red Keep. Gold cloaks fought to contain the mobs. The city watch would hang some looters for an example, but the crowds were so large that controlling them all was impossible. Barristan Selmy himself had to don his armor and ride through the streets, urging calm in the king's name. Ned spent every day juggling these crises, negotiating with guild masters, forcing wealthy merchants to open their stores, coordinating with the watch, and drafting messages to outlying areas for any possible grain deliveries by sea. Peter Baelish used the crown's last bits of gold to bribe Tyroshi traders into shipping grain. A handful made it through, but not nearly enough to feed the city. Between these chores, Ned visited the tower where Joffrey was kept. He felt a strange need to see the boy who had once been betrothed to Sansa and had nearly killed Arya's friend. The guards let him in reluctantly. Joffrey's chamber was sparse, with a narrow bed, a table, and a single window barred from the outside. Joffrey stood near that window as Ned entered. "Lord Stark," the boy spat, turning with a snarl. "Have you come to gloat?" Ned studied him. Joffrey was tall for his age, but still slender, with bright golden hair and a face contorted by anger. He wore a rumpled shirt and breeches. His eyes flicked to Ned with contempt. "I've come to see if you require anything," Ned said. "Food, water. Don't patronize me. I should be king. I am the rightful prince." Joffrey pounded a fist on the table. "And instead, I'm locked away like a common criminal." Ned did not bother refuting the claim. "Have you had enough to eat?" Joffrey's lip curled. "Oh yes, scraps and barley bread. Thanks so much. You treat the heir to the Iron Throne like a beggar. My mother will have your head for this." Ned resisted the urge to respond harshly. "You are here because the king says you are not his son by blood. Yet you might have had some measure of freedom if you had not threatened him so openly." "Threatened him? The usurper threatened me," Joffrey cried, eyes wild. "But I will show him. When my grandfather arrives, we'll cut off your traitor's head and feed it to the dogs." "We'll—" Ned took a step forward, voice low. "It need not end that way. If you keep your peace, if you show contrition, I have nothing to be sorry for." Joffrey's face reddened. Then he sneered. "Where are your daughters, Lord Stark? Hiding them from me? Are you?" A flicker of anger flared in Ned. "My daughters are safe. You will never harm them." Joffrey's laugh was cruel. "They will come to me on their knees when I am king, begging forgiveness. I might let them live." Ned exhaled, stepping back. Perhaps it had been pointless to come here. The boy was as full of hatred and delusion as ever. A child shaped by arrogance, by the twisted court he'd grown up in, by his mother's manipulations. "I see there's nothing to be gained," Ned said quietly. As he turned to go, Joffrey snarled one last time. "I hope you starve, you Starks. I hope the whole city starves. Then we can feed on your bones." Ned left, heart heavy. Outside the tower, the guards gave him a weary shrug. They heard Joffrey's tirades every day, and so another moon's turn passed. The city's morale sagged under hunger and fear, even as news of skirmishes reached them. Stannis was advancing, but slowly, as he secured towns in the Crownlands. Tywin had marched a portion of his forces north to block Stannis. The ring around King's Landing thinned. In theory, the city might have seized that moment to strike, but Robert hesitated, uncertain if he could risk all in open battle. Still, the partial relief allowed some food shipments in through the Rosby Road. Prices decreased slightly, easing the riots. Ned seized the chance to have the Gold Cloaks escort more supply wagons into the city. The siege was not broken, yet it was no longer as choking as before. One gray afternoon, as Ned oversaw the unloading of supply wagons in the outer yard, a messenger approached with a letter sealed by the direwolf of House Stark. He tore it open eagerly, scanning Robb's words. His son had reached Moat Cailin with a gathering of northern bannermen, uncertain whether to march down the King's Road or attempt a passage through the neck to the Riverlands. Rumors of Lannister forces in the area worried him. Robb wrote earnestly that he would do whatever his father commanded. Ned read the letter twice, then tucked it away. If Robb marched to King's Landing, he might find the roads blocked or risk tangling with a superior Lannister force. But if he did nothing, the war might pass him by until it was too late. Ned penned a swift reply, urging Robb to keep the host together in the neck for now, to watch for any sign that Tywin's men might head north. "Use caution," he wrote. "But if you see an opening to lift the siege or threaten the Lannisters' flank, do so." He sealed it with the Stark sigil, gave it to the messenger, and watched him depart. All the while, the yard bustled with men hauling sacks of grain. Baelish hovered nearby, scribbling in a ledger. Ned stepped over to him. "How much is this shipment?" he asked. 500 bushels of barley, 300 of wheat, 2 casks of salt fish, some onions, Baelish said, glancing up. Not enough to feed the entire city for more than a few days. But it's better than nothing. We must hope more follow behind. Ned nodded, scanning the wagons. Small mercies. And the finances? Peter shrugged. We're borrowing heavily. The Iron Bank of Bravos grows restless. Your friend King Robert has rung up quite a debt. He chuckled thinly. We must either win this war soon or face quite the retribution from foreign lenders as well as Tywin Lannister. Ned pressed his lips together. The realm was drowning in debt. But that was a concern for another day, overshadowed by the immediate crisis of war. The partial lifting of the blockade also brought travelers from the south. Some were refugees, others were hedge knights seeking coin. Through them, rumor spread that the Tyrells might soon commit themselves. Mace Tyrell, it was said, was in talks with Renly Baratheon, who lingered at Highgarden. The possibilities were endless. If the Tyrells joined Stannis, that might crush the Lannisters. Or if they sided with Tywin, the city would be lost. Or perhaps they would remain neutral, waiting to see which side triumphed. Late one evening, Ned returned to his chambers exhausted. He found Arya dozing by the hearth, needle across her lap. Sansa sat nearby, darning a ripped sleeve. The sight of them made his heart twist, reminding him why he fought so hard to maintain some semblance of peace. Arya stirred, blinking blearily. Father, is there news? Some, Ned said gently. A partial supply reached us, so the city will not starve yet. Her eyes flicked to the blade in her lap. What about the Lannisters? Will we fight? Ned sighed. We may. King Robert is eager for a victory, but Tywin is cunning. He would rather starve us out or corner us. And Mother? Bran? Rickon? Sansa asked anxiously. No word from them recently, but no news is good news. Winterfell should be safe. A soft hush fell. Ned settled into a chair, rubbing his weary brow. I promise, if the city is threatened with assault, I will find a way to get you both out. By sea if needed. I will not let you be taken or harmed. Sansa swallowed. Thank you, Father. Arya set her jaw. I can fight, she muttered. I'm not useless. Ned managed a faint smile. I know, dear one, but let us pray it doesn't come to that. 2 days later, everything changed again. A shrill horn call echoed from the western walls at dawn. Ned raced up to the battlements, heart pounding. The gold cloaks pointed out across the fields where a large dust cloud signaled troop movement. Trumpets could be heard from the Lannister lines. Then, through a spyglass, Ned saw columns of armed men with sigils unknown to him at first. In confusion, he scanned the banners until he recognized one among them. A golden rose on a green field. Tyrell. Gasping, Ned realized that Mace Tyrell's army, tens of thousands strong, had arrived from the south, encroaching on Tywin's flank. The very move that so many had speculated about. But to which side did they come? Ned's pulse raced. If they allied with Robert, the siege might be broken. If they allied with Tywin, then the city was doomed. Chaos erupted in the Lannister camp as they scrambled to position themselves. Ned heard roars of excitement from the gold cloaks on the wall. Then, to his amazement, a few hours later, the Tyrell banners advanced to within half a league of Tywin's lines and drew up in battle formation. Trumpets sounded from both armies. The watchers on the wall could see cavalry forming on either flank. Robert appeared behind Ned, panting, gripping the parapet. Gods be good. The rose banners. Are they here to fight Tywin, or to join him? Ned's heart hammered. We'll soon see. A tense hour followed. Through the spyglass, Ned watched small parties ride out for parley. At one point, a bright green banner with gold trim approached the Lannister lines, but Tywin did not shift position. Eventually, the small party withdrew. Then the Tyrell cavalry shifted, banners fluttering. Suddenly, horns blared a second time, and the Tyrell host surged forward in an unmistakable attack formation. They were charging Tywin's lines. The watchers on the wall erupted in cheers. Robert bellowed a laugh that reverberated over the battlements. Yes, they've come against Tywin. Ned stared, scarcely believing. Mace Tyrell's full might advanced, thousands of infantry and cavalry. Tywin's men reeled, hastening to form a cohesive defense. The city had a vantage point for the opening clash of a tremendous battle. Clouds of dust rose, archers loosed volleys from both sides. The metallic thunder of thousands of hooves was faint but unmistakable even across the distance. And so the Rose faced the Lion on the open fields west of King's Landing. Robert, almost manic with excitement, roared at the gold cloaks. "Open the gates! We can hit Tywin from behind and finish him." The watchers inside the city swarmed to comply. Ned seized Robert's arm. "Your Grace, wait. Are you certain? A rush out might lead us into chaos." Robert's eyes glowed with battle lust. "Certain? No. But if Tyrell is indeed attacking, this is our chance to smash Tywin once and for all." Reluctantly, Ned accepted that logic. The advantage was too precious to squander. He looked over the parapet again. Lannister lines buckled under the force of the Tyrell assault. If the city's defenders joined from behind, Tywin might be crushed. "Sound the horns," Robert bellowed. "Send the cavalry out first, followed by the infantry. I'll lead them myself." Ned pressed his lips tight. "At least allow me to organize the vanguard. We don't want chaos." "Do it," Robert said. But quickly, in a flurry of activity, the gold cloaks and the few loyal knights in the city mustered in the courtyard. Barristan Selmy donned his armor, pale with worry but resolute. Robert himself strapped on his breastplate, ignoring servants who tried to help. He tore off a piece of bread with his teeth, washing it down with ale, as if fueling himself for the fight. Ned hurried to gather the men of House Stark, placing Jory Castle's cousin Will in command of one flank. The city gates were flung open. It was a smaller force than Ned would have liked, so many had died or deserted, but they had the advantage of surprise. Robert led a wedge of heavy cavalry out, thundered down the road, and swerved to strike the Lannister rearguard. From the battlements, Ned watched as swords and lances flashed in the morning light, and dust churned into the air. Tywin's lines were now attacked from two directions. From the west by the Tyrell host, from the east by Robert's cavalry. In between, confusion reigned. Crimson banners swirling with golden lions tried to reform, horns blaring. The watchers could see patches of the battlefield where cavalry collided in violent bursts, the lines fluid, swirling. Ned had to trust Robert's battle prowess, for the king was in his element now, hammering away at the Lannisters with a warhammer that had once shattered Rhaegar Targaryen on the trident. For all his decline in recent years, Robert was still formidable on the field of battle, especially when drunk on the promise of victory. Barristan led a second wave. Ned sent a small infantry contingent after them, though not so large as to leave the city undefended. The partial blockade the Lannisters had around the walls began to crumble as watchers either fled or rushed to join the main fight. By midday, the entire plain west of the city was a battleground. From the parapets, Ned glimpsed Mace Tyrell himself, mounted and clad in ornate armor, with the Golden Rose standard. The Tyrell force dwarfed Robert's, but the king's presence behind Tywin's line was precisely what tipped the scale. Trumpets sounded. The Lannisters attempted to regroup around Tywin's command pavilion, but the Tyrell knights crashed into them from the flank, and Robert hammered them from behind. Pockets of fierce fighting erupted. The air above the battlefield shimmered with dust and the stench of blood. Ned sent more reinforcements when it looked like Robert's wedge might be overwhelmed by Lannister pikes. He prayed that Barristan and the king would hold until the Tyrell infantry arrived in full. On the walls, gold cloaks cheered every time they saw a Lannister banner topple. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, the Lannister lines collapsed. Word spread of mass desertions, men throwing down arms, knights spurring their horses to flee north or west. Pockets of die-hard Lannister loyalists fought on, but the bulk of the host broke. In the distance, Ned saw a flutter of the Great Lion's standard come down. Someone pointed out that Tywin's personal guard was retreating. A great roar went up from the Tyrell side, echoed by the watchers in the city. By late afternoon, the battlefield was littered with corpses. Smoke rose from a few burning supply wagons. Robert's force and the Tyrell host had encircled what remained of the Lannister core. Trumpets called for surrender. Ned hastened from the walls, heading down to the courtyard. He mounted a horse, determined to ride out and help secure the field. A contingent of House Stark men followed, along with a banner of gold cloaks. They passed through the city gate, stepping into the blood-soaked plain. The scent of death and mud was overwhelming. Bodies lay everywhere, red cloaks stained dark. Some wore green rose badges and had fallen as well, but the Lannisters clearly had the worst of it. War horses wandered, whinnying in panic. Cries and moans of the wounded rose all around. Ned forced his way through the carnage, searching for Robert. At last, he found the king near the remains of Tywin's command pavilion, a shredded mass of crimson cloth. Robert was astride a massive stallion, mail spattered in gore, warhammer clenched in his hand. Barristan Selmy, also bloodied but still upright, sat his horse nearby, as did a young Tyrell knight bearing the gold rose on his surcoat. Robert spotted Ned and let out a boisterous laugh. "Ned, we have them. Tywin has fled. The day is ours." Ned reined in, glancing around. "He escaped." Barristan nodded, grim-faced. "Yes, reports say he rode off with a small band of household knights. They broke away when the lines collapsed." The king spat. He left the field like a craven, presumably to regroup in the west. But his army is in tatters. Meanwhile, the Tyrell knight introduced himself as Ser Talon Flowers, a cousin of the main Tyrell line. "My lord father Mace Tyrell sends his compliments to his grace. He awaits you in yonder field." He gestured to a green banner not far away, behind a row of pikes. Robert slapped his thigh. "Then let us go see the fine lord who has saved my city from that cursed lion." He turned to Ned. "Come, let us see what House Tyrell wants in return." Ned followed them across the battlefield. Along the way, gold cloaks and Tyrell men were herding prisoners, gathering abandoned arms. Wounded men writhed, calling for maesters. Ned swallowed hard at the sheer scale of the devastation. This was what war always brought, no matter who emerged victorious. A large green tent had been erected in the midst of the field for the Tyrell High Command. Mace Tyrell stood outside, a stout man with curling hair and a bushy mustache, wearing elaborate plate etched with vines and roses. With him stood a cluster of knights, among them the famed Ser Loras Tyrell, recently bested by the Hound in the throne room, and others bearing the proud rose. When Robert arrived, Mace Tyrell bowed. "Your Grace," he said grandly, "House Tyrell offers you greetings. We come to defend the Iron Throne from Lannister treachery, and I am pleased to see our armies have prevailed." Robert dismounted heavily, handing his reins to a squire. He eyed Mace Tyrell up and down. "So you do. Well met, Lord Tyrell. I'd have your reason for this timely arrival. Are you allied with my brother Renly?" Mace Tyrell gave a broad, slightly pompous smile. "Why, Renly Baratheon is currently at Highgarden, forging an alliance with my dear daughter Marjorie." His eyes darted to Ned. "But let it be known we have come in loyalty to the crown. The Lannisters have shown their perfidy. We cannot abide incest and treason, especially not against a rightful king." Robert let out a booming laugh. "A rightful king, am I? For a moment, I thought the realm forgot that." Mace Tyrell bowed again. "We do not forget, your grace. My only regret is we could not come sooner." Ned, standing behind Robert, studied Mace Tyrell's smug expression. Clearly, the Lord of Highgarden was playing the Game of Thrones with skill. He arrived at the perfect moment, ensuring the destruction of Tywin's host, and thus earning Robert's gratitude. No doubt Mace expected a rich reward, perhaps more influence at court or a Riage alliance that might place a Tyrell on the throne eventually if Robert had no heir. Robert was too pleased with victory to worry about that for the moment. "You have my thanks," he said, clapping Mace on the shoulder so hard the man wobbled. "I lost track of how many lion skulls I crushed out there. The damned beasts never stood a chance once your cavalry swept in." Mace beamed. Ser Loras, for his part, watched with polite reserve. He had a cut above his brow but was otherwise unscathed. Ned gave him a respectful nod. He remembered how the young Tyrell had dueled Sandor and lost. Even so, Loras was known for his skill. He had likely fought valiantly this day. Robert wiped sweat from his brow. We must talk terms. Tywin's main host is routed, but not destroyed. He'll slink back to Casterly Rock if he can. We must press the advantage or he'll regroup. Mace Tyrell nodded. We stand ready, but let us retire to a more suitable location. The stench of corpses is hardly fit for negotiation. So it was agreed that the parties would return to the city to parley. Mace Tyrell left a portion of his army to secure the battlefield and gather spoils, while another portion marched triumphantly toward King's Landing. The city gates swung wide, and the small folk on the walls cheered at the sight of the banners with the golden rose. The crowds, half-starved and weary, roared in delight. Lannister banners had been toppled, their remnants fleeing in panic. Within the Red Keep, a great feast was hastily prepared to honor the Tyrells. The kitchens bustled, using up precious stores of meat, bread, and wine to celebrate. Robert was unstoppable, slapping men on the back, repeating stories of how he smashed the Lannister line from behind. Baelish and Varys moved among the throng, slyly gleaning information from the new guests. Ned oversaw the reception, ensuring every courtesy was extended. Even though the city was hardly in a position to feast, Robert insisted on a lavish event to mark this victory. At the grand feast in the throne room that night, the atmosphere was jubilant. Soldiers from both the Tyrell and Crown forces mingled. Mace Tyrell sat at the high table next to Robert, with Ned on the other side. Ser Loras sat further down. Large casks of Arbor gold wine were tapped, and the music of lutes and drums filled the air. Yet Ned could not help but notice the tension that lingered beneath the revelry. The city was still battered, hungry, and half-riotous. The Lannisters were not entirely beaten. Tywin had escaped, and the question of what to do with Jaime, Cersei, and their children loomed. Meanwhile, the Tyrells had saved King's Landing but would surely expect a great reward, and they might press for Renly's advantage or some arrangement that gave Highgarden more sway. Still, for one night at least, the realm celebrated. Robert roared for the minstrels to sing bawdy songs, his cheeks red with wine, proclaiming that the king's justice had prevailed. Near the feast's end, Robert turned to Ned. Come, let us have Cersei brought forth. I want to see the look on her face when she hears her father's host has been shattered. Maybe now she'll see who truly holds power. Ned winced but had no real grounds to refuse. He nodded to a guard. Soon enough, Cersei was ushered in under escort, wearing a simple blue gown, her chin high. Myrcella and Tommen were left behind in the tower, though Ned suspected Robert wanted them too. But for tonight, Cersei alone was enough. When she beheld the Tyrell banners and the wine-soaked revelers, she knew something major had happened. Her face tightened. Robert bellowed from the high table. Your dear father is in flight, my lady wife. His army is crushed. That's what comes of defying the rightful king. Cersei's green eyes blazed with hatred. Congratulations, husband, she said icily. You triumphed today, but do not think my father will simply vanish. Robert laughed, banging a fist on the table. What I think is that you'll remain my prisoner. My terms to Tywin will be twice as harsh now. Maybe I'll even take Casterly Rock as forfeit. Wouldn't that be fitting, Ned? Ned frowned but remained silent. Mace Tyrell gave a hearty chuckle, raising a wine cup. Cersei bristled. You cannot hold the rock, she snapped. You do not know my father if you believe he'll bow. Then let him come again, Robert declared. And I'll smash him again. He gestured to a pair of drummers, who pounded a triumphant rhythm. The crowd cheered and stomped. Cersei glared, but in the face of such numbers, she was helpless. Finally, Robert waved a dismissive hand. Take her away. I'll summon her again if I feel like tormenting her with more news of Tywin's failures. The gold cloaks led her out. Her parting glance burned at Ned, and he felt a flicker of pity. The feast wore on, but Ned did not linger. Once the king was lost to drink and boisterous conversation with Mace Tyrell, Ned slipped away. He moved through the Red Keep's corridors, heading to the ramparts. He needed quiet air to calm his mind. Outside, the night sky was clear, with stars shimmering over the city's rooftops. The plain west of the walls was dark, save for the scattered lanterns of Tyrell pickets. The day's victory had been decisive, but the war was far from over. Tywin would never simply vanish. And what of Stannis, still approaching from the north with his fleet and army? Now that King's Landing was no longer besieged, how would Robert balance the presence of Stannis and the arrival of the Tyrells? And where did that leave the question of succession? If there was no king's heir recognized, the realm's lords might fight anew. Joffrey was disowned, Myrcella and Tommen were bastards by law, and Robert had no legitimate children. Would Robert try to sire a new heir with some other wife or name Stannis as heir, or perhaps even Renly? The intrigues were endless. Quiet footsteps sounded behind Ned. He turned to see Ser Barristan approach, the old knight looking weary yet relieved. "Lord Stark," Barristan said softly, "a glorious victory, though a bloody one. Glorious, perhaps, but we must not rejoice too soon. Tywin has lost a battle, not the war." Barristan nodded. "True enough, but for tonight the city breathes easier." He hesitated, then added, "About the Queen. Do you think the king will show mercy now?" Ned stared at the flickering lanterns in the distance. Robert's mood is uncertain. With Tywin's defeat, he may feel less threatened, more inclined to cruelty. But if the realm is to avoid further bloodshed, we must find a resolution for the Lannisters. A formal trial or a negotiated settlement. Something. Barristan bowed his head. "I fear you are right." They stood in silence for a time, letting the cool night air wash over them. Far below, the city's common folk might have found a sliver of hope that the siege was lifted. But they still faced hunger, chaos, and the possibility of future conflict. Eventually, Barristan murmured, "I will see you on the morrow, my lord. We have much to set in order." Ned nodded and watched the old knight depart. Alone on the rampart, he found his mind drifting to Cat in the Vale, to his sons in Winterfell, to the uncertain alliances swirling around them. The banner of the direwolf might yet be needed on the battlefield if Tywin rallied. He closed his eyes, remembering his father's words about the burdens of honor. A single action in the throne room, revealing the truth about Joffrey's parentage, had brought them to this point. Would it truly lead to a better realm in the end, or only more war and heartbreak? The old gods offered no answer, only the hush of the night. At length he turned and made his way back inside. The future stretched before him like a dark and winding road. Yet he knew one thing. The Game of Thrones was far from over. The clash of lions and stags had begun, joined now by roses and stags, with wolves on the horizon and the kraken of Stannis looming at sea. In that vast tangle, House Stark would stand as it always had. For honor, for truth. The cost might be high, but Ned would pay it if it meant sparing the innocent and upholding the laws that bound them all. He could only hope the realm would survive the storms yet to come, and that someday, perhaps years from now, peace would reign once more upon the Iron Throne, whether by Robert's line or another's. Until that day, Ned Stark would do his duty, and though he carried the weight of it like a cold stone in his chest, he found small solace in the knowledge that for one night, at least King's Landing would not burn.